My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am 28 years old, and I work as a medical billing specialist. Last month, my parents stood in a cemetery dressed in somber black. They wept bitterly as they lowered an empty casket into the ground. They accepted condolences from friends and neighbors. Then they marched straight to probate court to file my death certificate. Their goal was simple. They wanted to seize my grandmother Beatrice's $6 million trust fund, but they made one fatal miscalculation. When my grandmother's attorney stood up in that courtroom and pressed play on her final video, recorded, "Will the fake tears dried up instantly?" My parents and my sister turned pale as ghosts. Because the deceased daughter they were mourning, the one whose tragic death was supposed to make them millionaires, was standing right behind them in a white suit, with federal agents waiting in the hall. Before I tell you exactly what happened in that courtroom, and how I trapped my own family in their greedy lie, please take a moment to like this video, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories about absolute justice. I would also love to know where you are watching from today, and what time it is in your city, so drop a comment below. Working as a medical billing specialist taught me a lot about fraud. Every day I comb through patient records and insurance claims looking for discrepancies. I look for codes that do not match the diagnosis. I look for dates that overlap. I look for lies hidden in plain sight. It requires a meticulous eye and a refusal to take things at face value. I suppose I developed those skills long before I ever stepped foot in a hospital administration office. I developed them simply by surviving my own family. To understand how my parents could bury an empty box and pretend I was dead, you have to understand that I was never really alive to them in the first place. I grew up in a beautiful 4-bedroom house in suburban Atlanta. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. My father, Robert, was a mid-level corporate manager, and my mother, Susan, dedicated her life to maintaining our social image. But inside those walls, love was a limited resource, and my older sister, Emily, held a total monopoly. Emily is 2 years older than me, and she was born to be the golden child. She had my mother's perfect blonde hair and my father's outgoing personality. Whenever company came over, Emily was paraded around like a prize-winning racehorse. She attended an elite private academy where tuition cost more than a luxury car. When she turned 16, my parents bought her a brand new convertible with a giant red bow on the hood. I remember watching from the living room window as my mother cried happy tears and my father called her his little princess. When I turned 16, I received a $50 gift card to a department store and a lecture about how I needed to get an after-school job to start paying for my own car insurance. I was the excess child, the spare part. I wore Emily's hand-me-downs, even though we were completely different sizes. While Emily spent her summers at European art camps, I scrubbed floors at a local diner to save money for college. I never asked for a new car. I never asked for European vacations. I just wanted them to look at me the way they looked at her. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could earn my spot in the family. I maintained a perfect grade point average. I stayed out of trouble. I quietly deposited every paycheck from the diner into a savings account for my future. By the time I was 18, I had saved $15,000. It was my ticket to a state university and a chance to make something of myself. I was so proud of that bank account. I used to look at the balance statement and imagine a future where my parents might finally say they were proud of me. That fantasy shattered 2 weeks before my high school graduation. I came home from a double shift at the diner smelling like grease and bleach. My parents and Emily were sitting around the kitchen table. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Emily was crying, real heavy sobs that made her shoulders shake. My mother was rubbing her back, and my father looked like a thundercloud was hovering over his head. I asked what was wrong. My father looked at me with cold calculation. He told me Emily was in a bit of trouble. She was a sophomore in college at the time, and had secretly opened 3 different credit cards. She maxed them out on designer clothes, luxury vacations, and expensive dinners with her sorority sisters. The total debt was $14,500. The credit card companies were threatening legal action, and it was going to ruin her credit score before she even graduated. I felt a pang of sympathy until my mother spoke. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "We need you to transfer your college savings to Emily's account tomorrow morning." She said it so casually, like she was asking me to pass the salt. I stood there in my dirty work uniform, unable to process the words. I asked her what she meant, She sighed like I was being intentionally difficult. She said Emily's future was on the line, and family takes care of family. I remember standing in the kitchen staring at the worn linoleum floor. I had spent countless hours mopping that exact floor just to earn my keep in their house. $15,000. It was a staggering amount of money for a teenager. It represented every weekend I missed out on going to the mall with friends. It represented every summer afternoon I spent wiping down tables and dealing with rude customers while Emily was out getting manicures and attending pool parties. That money was my escape hatch. It was my only guarantee that I would not be trapped in this house forever. For the first time in my entire life, I looked at my parents and said no. When I said the word no, the temperature in the room plummeted. Emily gasped like I had just slapped her across the face. My mother slowly stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. She walked over to me, her eyes narrowed into slits of pure disgust. She told me I was the most selfish creature she had ever met. She said she fed me, clothed me, and put a roof over my head for 18 years, and this was how I repaid her. I tried to speak. I tried to explain that I needed that money for tuition so I could get a degree and secure my future. My father did not want to hear it. He stepped forward, pointing a heavy finger at my chest. He said Emily was delicate. She was sensitive and could not handle the crushing weight of financial ruin. But he said I was tough. I was used to struggling. I could easily take out student loans and work my way through college because I did not need the same comforts Emily needed. The sheer audacity of his logic paralyzed me. He slammed his hand on the counter and told me if I was not willing to sacrifice for this family when they needed it, then I was no longer part of this family. He told me to pack my things and get out. I was 18 years old. I had barely graduated high school. I looked into my mother's eyes, searching for any trace of maternal love or protection. I found absolutely nothing. She crossed her arms and told me I had 1 hour to gather my belongings. I walked up to my room and packed everything I owned into 2 cheap duffel bags. Nobody came upstairs to stop me. Nobody offered to help. When I walked back down the stairs, my father was sitting in his recliner watching television. Emily was back on her phone, texting her friends, miraculously cured of her devastating tears. My mother opened the front door and stood aside, waiting for me to leave. I stepped out into the humid Georgia night and heard the deadbolt slide into place behind me. That click was the sound of my family erasing me from their lives. I spent my first few nights sleeping on a worn-out couch in my manager's basement. I eventually rented a tiny studio apartment above a noisy laundromat. It smelled constantly of bleach and hot dryer lint. The floorboards sagged and the window let in the freezing winter drafts. But when I locked that flimsy door at night, I finally felt safe. Nobody was going to barge in and demand my money. Nobody was going to compare me to a golden standard I could never reach. I enrolled in a local community college and kept working at the diner. It was an exhausting, lonely existence. There were nights I sat on my mattress eating cheap ramen noodles, wondering why I was so unlovable. Why my own parents could throw me onto the street to protect my sister's shopping habit. But I survived. I took night classes and earned my certification in medical billing. I got a stable job at a regional hospital. I learned how to navigate complex insurance claims and hospital codes. I built a quiet, peaceful life. I thought my silence and my distance would protect me. I thought if I stayed out of their way, they would simply forget about me and leave me alone. Over the next 10 years, I heard from them exactly twice. Both times were an exercise in humiliation. The first was when Emily got married. She married a man named Chad, a wealthy real estate broker who cared more about his golf handicap than anything else. My mother mailed me an invitation 3 weeks before the wedding. It was not a gesture of reconciliation. It was a demand for an audience. I attended out of a foolish, lingering hope that things might have changed. I sat in the back row of a lavish country club ballroom. My parents had taken out a second mortgage to pay for the extravagant affair. Emily wore a custom silk gown. Chad looked like he stepped out of a luxury watch commercial. During the reception, my father gave a toast. He raised his crystal champagne flute and talked about how Emily was his only pride and joy. He said she was the light of their lives and the only daughter who truly understood family loyalty. I was sitting at table number 12 right next to the swinging kitchen doors, smelling the discarded food. I quietly set down my water glass, walked out the back exit, and drove home. I promised myself I would never let them hurt me again. The second time they reached out was just 3 years ago, when they wanted me to co-sign a loan because they had bankrupted themselves paying for Emily's lifestyle. I politely declined and blocked their numbers. I accepted my role as the outcast. I accepted that I would never have a loving mother, or a protective father, or a sister who cared about my existence. I made my peace with the fact that I was practically an orphan with living parents, but I was not entirely alone. I still had one connection to my bloodline, one person who saw right through my parents and their golden child. My grandmother Beatrice. My father's mother was a wealthy, shrewd widow who lived in a beautiful historic home across town. She had built a fortune in commercial real estate alongside my grandfather. When he passed away, she managed their empire with ruthless efficiency. Beatrice did not tolerate fools, and she absolutely despised my mother's social climbing antics. While my parents were ignoring me, Beatrice was quietly checking in. She never openly fought with my father about me because she knew it would only make my parents resent me more. Instead, she operated in the shadows. We had secret weekly phone calls. Sometimes we met for coffee on the other side of the city where my parents never went. Beatrice knew exactly how hard I worked. She knew about the diner, about the community college, and about my job at the hospital. She also knew exactly how financially reckless my parents and Emily had become. I thought keeping my relationship with Beatrice a secret was just a way to avoid family drama. I had no idea that my grandmother was carefully setting the stage for the most elaborate act of justice I could ever imagine. I did not know that she was planning to use me to expose the absolute moral rot of her own son, and I certainly never imagined that her plan would require me to step completely off the grid. The real nightmare did not begin with my grandmother's death. It began with a desperate late-night phone call that set a terrifying chain of events into motion. It began with an urgent demand that would isolate me in the wilderness, cut me off from the civilized world, and give my parents the perfect opportunity to declare me legally dead. For years, I lived in the shadows of my own family. I paid my rent, I went to my hospital job, and I completely accepted my role as the outcast. But my parents never knew that I possessed one crucial lifeline that kept my spirit from breaking. I secretly maintained contact with my grandmother Beatrice. She was my father's mother, and she was a force of nature. Beatrice was a wealthy widow who had built a commercial real estate empire alongside my late grandfather. She lived in a sprawling historic home in the wealthy Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta, but she never let the money soften her sharp edges. She was fiercely intelligent, endlessly practical, and entirely immune to my mother's social climbing manipulation. Beatrice saw right through my parents. She knew exactly how my sister Emily manipulated them, and she knew exactly how cruelly they had discarded me. We kept our relationship completely hidden to avoid the inevitable explosion it would cause if my father ever found out. Beatrice knew that if my parents realized she was secretly supporting me, they would make both of our lives miserable. They would demand a share of her attention and her money, claiming it was only fair. So we operated like two spies in our own city. Every other Sunday morning, while my parents and Emily were putting on a performance of perfect devotion at their country club brunch, Beatrice and I would meet at a quiet, unassuming coffee shop on the far side of town. Those Sunday mornings saved my life. Beatrice would sit across from me in her tailored suits, sipping black coffee, and she would teach me about the world. She taught me about commercial leases, about property taxes, and about how to read financial statements. She wanted me to understand how money worked because she knew my parents were drowning in debt to fund their luxury lifestyle. She would often shake her head and tell me that my father was a fool who confused appearing wealthy with actually being wealthy. She told me that true power was quiet and that empty barrels always made the most noise. Beatrice validated my existence. She looked at my modest studio apartment and my medical billing certification, and she told me she was incredibly proud of the woman I was becoming. She built up my confidence brick by brick, entirely undoing the damage my mother and father had inflicted on my sense of self-worth. But our quiet sanctuary shattered late last fall. Beatrice was 79 years old and had been managing a mild heart condition for years. One Tuesday afternoon, she suffered a massive stroke. It happened suddenly while she was meeting with her financial advisors, By the time the ambulance rushed her to the prominent private hospital downtown, my parents had already received the emergency phone call. They descended on that hospital like vultures circling a fresh kill. I did not find out about the stroke until the next morning. Beatrice's private attorney, a kind man named David Caldwell, discreetly called my cell phone to give me the news. He knew about our secret relationship, and he warned me that the situation at the hospital was extremely volatile. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced to the intensive care unit on my lunch break. I just wanted to hold her hand. I just wanted to see her face and tell her I was there. But when I approached the visitor desk at the intensive care wing, the duty nurse looked at her computer screen and frowned. She asked for my identification. When I handed her my driver's license, she shook her head with a look of genuine pity. She told me she could not let me through. She explained that Robert and Susan Jenkins had officially registered as the sole emergency contacts. They had placed Beatrice on a highly restricted privacy list. My parents had specifically instructed the hospital staff that absolutely no unauthorized visitors were allowed, citing the patient's delicate condition and a desire to avoid family stress. They had literally barricaded my grandmother to monopolize her final days. I stood there in the bright fluorescent light of the hospital corridor, shaking with a mixture of profound grief and boiling anger. Through the double glass doors of the intensive care unit, I could actually see my mother standing in the hallway near Beatrice's room. She was holding a tissue to her face, putting on a magnificent performance of the devastated daughter-in-law for the medical staff. My father was pacing back and forth, with his phone pressed to his ear, probably already calculating the value of the estate he assumed he was about to inherit. They were sealing me out so they could control the narrative and secure their payout. They wanted to make sure Beatrice was completely isolated from the only family member who genuinely loved her, without an ulterior motive. I walked away from the visitor desk without causing a scene. I knew that arguing with the nurses would only result in security escorting me out of the building, which was exactly the kind of unhinged behavior my parents would use to justify banning me permanently. I went back to my job at the regional hospital, but I could barely focus on my billing codes. I had to see Beatrice. I had to know if she was conscious, if she was in pain, and if she knew I had tried to come. That evening I realized I had a distinct advantage my parents had entirely overlooked. I worked in the medical administration field. I knew exactly how hospital systems operated. I knew the shift change schedules, the security blind spots, and the universal language of hospital employees. More importantly, my hospital identification badge looked remarkably similar to the standard vendor badges used by affiliated medical networks across the city. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I drove back to the private hospital where Beatrice was being held. I parked in the designated employee garage, counting on the tired night attendant to barely glance at the medical badge clipped to my scrub jacket. I wore a pair of dark blue hospital scrubs and carried a clipboard filled with blank billing forms. To anyone passing by in the quiet, dim hallways of the midnight shift, I was just another administrative worker doing a late-night audit on patient charts. I walked confidently past the main security desk, took the staff service elevator up to the intensive care floor, and bypassed the main visitor entrance entirely by using the secondary supply corridor. The intensive care unit was eerily quiet at that hour. The only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors and the soft hum of ventilation systems. I slipped past the central nursing station while the attending staff were distracted by a patient alarm down the hall. I memorized Beatrice's room number from my earlier attempt and pushed open the heavy wooden door, slipping inside and letting it close silently behind me. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the medical equipment measuring her vital signs. Beatrice looked incredibly frail lying in that sterile hospital bed. The stroke had weakened the left side of her body, and an oxygen cannula rested beneath her nose. I moved to the side of the bed and gently took her right hand in mine. Her skin was cool and papery. I whispered her name, terrified that she might not wake up, or worse, that she might not recognize me. But Beatrice was a fighter. Her eyelids fluttered open and she turned her head slightly to look at me. The right side of her face formed a weak but unmistakable smile. Her grip on my fingers tightened with a surprising amount of strength. I felt tears spill over my eyelashes and run down my cheeks as I told her I was so sorry I could not come sooner and that my parents had locked down the visitor list. Beatrice squeezed my hand again to silence me. Her voice was raspy and low, struggling against the weakness in her chest, but her mind was as brilliantly sharp as ever. She told me she knew exactly what Robert and Susan were doing. She said they had been hovering over her bed all day, pretending to cry, while not so subtly asking the doctors how much time she had left. She told me my father had even brought an attorney into the room, trying to get her to sign a revised power of attorney document while she was heavily medicated. Beatrice had refused to sign anything. She told me she had kicked the attorney out of the room using words I cannot repeat. I begged her to let me call David Caldwell to intervene to demand that I be added to the visitor list. I told her I could fight them in court for access. But Beatrice slowly shook her head. She pulled me a little closer, forcing me to lean down so she could speak directly into my ear. She told me she did not have much time left. Her heart was failing, and she knew her body was giving out. But she promised me that she had spent the last 5 years preparing for exactly this moment. She said she had built an ironclad legal fortress that my parents could never break, but to make it work, she needed me to do something that would feel incredibly wrong. She needed me to disappear. A few weeks prior, during one of our Sunday coffee meetings, I had mentioned a medical volunteer program I was desperately hoping to join. It was a rigorous 6-week humanitarian mission providing administrative and clinical support to free medical clinics in the deeply impoverished regions of the Appalachian Mountains. The clinics were located in extremely remote, heavily forested areas of rural West Virginia and Kentucky, miles away from the nearest town. The catch was that the region had absolutely no cellular reception and no internet access. The volunteers lived in basic cabins and worked entirely off the grid to serve the isolated mountain communities. I had told Beatrice I wanted to go because it would significantly boost my administrative resume for a promotion. But I simply could not afford to take 6 weeks of unpaid leave from my hospital job. Lying in her hospital bed fighting for breath, Beatrice looked me directly in the eyes and brought up that Appalachian trip. She told me she had already wired the equivalent of 2 months' salary directly into my private checking account. She ordered me to submit my leave of absence the next morning and join that volunteer mission immediately. She insisted that I pack my bags, drive up into the mountains, and vanish from the grid for the entire 6 weeks. I was completely horrified. I told her I could not possibly leave her while she was dying in a hospital bed surrounded by people who only wanted her money. I begged her to let me stay in Atlanta. I told her I did not care about the volunteer trip anymore. I only cared about being by her side. But Beatrice was unrelenting. She gripped my hand with a fierce, desperate urgency. She told me that my presence in Atlanta was the only thing standing between my parents and the trap she had carefully laid for them. She explained that as long as my parents knew I was nearby, they would act cautiously. They would cover their tracks and play the role of the grieving family perfectly. But if I was completely unreachable, if I vanished without a trace into a region where no one could contact me, their unchecked greed would make them reckless. They would make a massive, irreversible mistake. She took a slow, rattling breath and delivered the instruction that would ultimately destroy my parents. She said, "Go ahead, I have already set a trap for them here." She told me to trust her attorney David Caldwell and to trust the legal mechanisms she had put in place. She made me swear on her life that I would not try to contact her or anyone else in Atlanta until the 6 weeks were entirely over. She told me that no matter what happened, no matter what I felt, I had to stay hidden in those mountains. I cried silently beside her bed for another 20 minutes. I kissed her forehead and told her I loved her more than anyone else in the world. She smiled her crooked smile and told me she loved me too, and that everything she was doing was to make sure I would never have to scrub another floor or worry about a hostile family ever again. I slipped out of the intensive care unit the same way I came in, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. I walked back to my car in the cold, damp parking garage with a heavy, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. The next morning I did exactly what she commanded. I walked into my supervisor's office and requested an immediate emergency leave of absence for humanitarian work. Thanks to Beatrice's quiet financial support, I did not have to worry about making my rent. I spent the entire afternoon frantically packing my duffel bags with heavy boots, thermal clothing, and basic supplies. I did not tell a single soul where I was going. I did not leave a forwarding address. I simply packed my life into the trunk of my reliable old sedan and prepared to drive north. As I pulled onto the interstate leaving Atlanta behind, I could not shake the terrible feeling of dread sitting heavy in my chest. I felt like I was abandoning the only person who had ever truly loved me. I had no way of knowing how fast Beatrice's health would decline, and I had absolutely no idea what kind of trap she had arranged with her lawyer. I was simply trusting the brilliant, calculating mind of a woman who knew human nature better than anyone. I drove for hundreds of miles, watching the city skyline fade into the rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills, and eventually the dense, towering forests of the Appalachian Mountains. The roads grew narrower and more winding. The gas stations became sparse, and the radio stations faded into static. As I navigated my car up a steep gravel mountain pass toward the volunteer base camp, I watched the bars on my cell phone slowly drop. 3 bars, 2 bars, 1 bar, and then finally a red slash indicating absolutely no service. I was completely disconnected from the world. I set off on that 6-week journey to honor my grandmother's dying wish, completely unaware of the monstrous events unfolding back home. I had absolutely no idea that my sudden disappearance was exactly the golden opportunity my parents had been waiting for. I did not know that by removing myself from the grid, I was handing them the perfect excuse to orchestrate the most sinister sociopathic lie imaginable. They were about to erase me from the face of the earth, and I was entirely oblivious to the nightmare waiting for me when I finally returned to civilization. The air in the remote Appalachian Mountains tasted entirely different from the heavy, suffocating smog of Atlanta. It was sharp and cold, carrying the thick scent of pine needles, damp earth, and ancient stone. Our volunteer base camp was situated deep within a jagged valley surrounded by towering ridges that looked like the teeth of a sleeping giant. The nearest paved highway was 40 miles away. The closest town with a functioning grocery store or a hospital was an hour and a half down a winding, treacherous logging road that hugged the edge of a massive cliff. My cell phone had lost its signal long before I parked my car near the cluster of aging wooden cabins that would serve as our home and our clinic. I was completely disconnected from the grid, just as my grandmother Beatrice had commanded. For the first 3 days, we threw ourselves entirely into the work. Our medical team consisted of 2 retired emergency room doctors, 3 dedicated nurses, and a small handful of administrative and support staff like me. We converted an old, reinforced concrete community center into a functioning triage station. The local residents began arriving before the sun even crested the mountain peaks. These were resilient, hard-working people who had not seen a doctor in years due to poverty and isolation. They brought us untreated infections, chronic respiratory illnesses from the coal mines, and shattered bones that had healed entirely wrong. I sat at a folding metal table, managing the chaotic flow of paper records. Because we had absolutely no internet access to verify digital insurance claims or electronic health databases, I had to rely entirely on my manual administrative skills. I organized patient intake files, cross-referenced medication histories, and kept the clinic running with meticulous precision. The work was incredibly exhausting, but it felt exceptionally pure. I was far away from the sterile corporate hospital environment, and even further away from the toxic, crushing gravity of my parents and my sister Emily. I thought I was simply fulfilling a final desperate promise to my grandmother. I thought I was just hiding in the woods for 6 weeks to let her brilliant legal trap snap shut back home. I had absolutely no idea that the mountain itself was about to turn against us. Everything changed on the afternoon of the 4th day. The sky did not just grow dark. It turned a bruised, violent shade of purple that made the hairs on my arms stand up in alarm. The air pressure dropped so rapidly and so intensely that my ears popped and my chest felt tight. The local volunteers looked up at the sky with genuine terror in their eyes and started screaming for everyone to get inside the reinforced concrete basement of the community center. The rain did not fall in normal drops. It fell in solid, punishing sheets that instantly turned the dusty ground into thick, clinging mud. Then came the terrifying sound. It started as a low, vibrating rumble deep within the earth that traveled straight through the soles of my heavy boots. Within seconds, that rumble amplified into a deafening, apocalyptic roar that sounded like a fleet of freight trains driving directly over the roof of our building. The mountain above our camp was literally tearing itself apart. The ground shook violently as millions of tons of mud, massive boulders, and ancient uprooted trees cascaded down the steep slopes at terrifying speeds. The flash flood hit the valley floor with unimaginable catastrophic force. Through the small, reinforced glass windows of the basement, I watched in absolute horror as a towering wall of brown, churned water swallowed our entire parking area. my reliable old sedan. The car that held my clothes, my return route, and my only physical connection to my past life was swept away like a cheap plastic toy. The raging water ripped giant oak trees out by their roots and completely pulverized the wooden cabins where we had slept just hours before. The main logging road, the absolute only way in or out of our isolated valley, was instantaneously buried under 40 feet of impenetrable rock and debris. When the roaring finally stopped several hours later, we cautiously emerged from the basement into a landscape that was entirely unrecognizable. The power lines were snapped like fragile twigs, leaving dangerous cables buried in the mud. The underground landline telephone cables were completely severed. We were entirely trapped. There was absolutely no electricity. There was no clean running water. There was no cellular reception, and absolutely no way to communicate with the outside world to call for help. What was supposed to be a standard temporary medical volunteer mission instantly morphed into a desperate, grueling war for survival. The first week was fueled entirely by pure adrenaline and sheer panic. The flash flood and subsequent landslides had devastated the surrounding mountain homesteads, leaving dozens of locals severely injured and homeless. Our makeshift clinic in the surviving concrete community center quickly filled to capacity with trauma victims. We had deep lacerations, crushed limbs, and severe hypothermia to treat. The retired doctors performed minor emergency surgeries on folding tables using flashlights held by volunteers and sterilized sewing thread when our proper medical sutures quickly ran out. As the administrative support, I was suddenly forced to step far outside my comfort zone. I had to act as a triage, nurse, a supply manager, and a grief counselor all at once. I spent my days tearing up clean bed sheets to make pressure bandages and boiling collected rainwater over an outdoor fire pit to sanitize our remaining surgical tools. I rationed out our rapidly dwindling supply of antibiotics and painkillers with terrifying precision, knowing that every single pill was the difference between life and death for our patients. The nights were undeniably the hardest part of the ordeal. Without any electricity, the mountain darkness was absolute freezing and suffocating. We huddled together on the cold concrete floor, sharing incredibly meager portions of canned beans and stale crackers from the community center pantry. During those long, freezing nights, my mind would inevitably drift back to the hospital room in Atlanta. I worried constantly about my grandmother Beatrice. I wondered if her heart was still holding on, or if she had already slipped away. I wondered if she knew about the massive storm that had swallowed me whole. I prayed that David Caldwell had executed whatever brilliant legal maneuver she had planned to protect her estate, and then a much darker thought would inevitably creep into my mind. I wondered if my parents were watching the national news. I wondered if my mother felt even a tiny microscopic sliver of maternal panic knowing her youngest daughter was trapped in a catastrophic disaster zone. The bitter truth is I already knew the answer. I knew they probably did not care if I was freezing in the dark. I forcefully pushed those painful thoughts away and focused entirely on the bleeding patients lying on the tables in front of me. Survival required absolute focus. Days blurred heavily into weeks. The thick mud slowly dried into hard, cracked earth, but the massive debris fields blocking the mountain pass remained completely impassable. We lived like ghosts forgotten by the modern civilized world. Week 2 slowly dragged into week 3. Our food supplies dropped to dangerously critical levels. We started foraging for wild edibles and roots, with the help of the desperate locals, just to keep our stomachs from cramping with severe hunger. I lost 15 pounds. My hands were blistered and calloused. My scrubs were permanently stained with mud and dried blood. By week 4, the intense psychological toll began to crush the morale of our entire medical team. The nurses wept quietly in the dark corners of the basement. The doctors stared blankly at the concrete walls completely out of medical supplies. Everyone was wondering the exact same terrifying thing. Why had the rescue helicopters not arrived? Why was nobody coming for us? We did not realize that the sheer geographical scale of the disaster meant that state and federal recovery efforts were focused entirely on the more densely populated towns located miles down the mountain. We were just a tiny, insignificant dot on a massive, regional map of destruction. We had simply slipped right through the cracks of the government emergency response grid. We were completely isolated for 5 agonizing weeks of near starvation, grueling medical labor, and profound, deafening silence. While we were fighting for our literal lives in the mud and the dark, the rest of the country was watching our terrifying nightmare unfold on high-definition television screens. The Appalachian landslide and flash flood became a dominant, tragic national news story. Polished news anchors stood dramatically in front of washed-out highway bridges miles below our elevation, pointing urgently to the jagged mountain peaks where our volunteer camp was buried. They reported the staggering, devastating statistics around the clock. Thousands of homes completely destroyed, hundreds of millions of dollars in catastrophic infrastructural damage, and the most terrifying number of all, a massive growing list of missing persons. The authorities quickly established emergency telephone hotlines for families to report their loved ones who were known to be traveling or working in the designated disaster zone. Relatives from across the country flooded the emergency response centers with frantic, desperate phone calls. Mothers pleaded on national television for helicopter searches. Fathers drove to the police barricades demanding to join the rescue teams on foot. Spouses plastered social media platforms with photographs of the missing, begging the public for any scrap of information. That is what normal, loving families do when an unexpected tragedy strikes. They fight to find their blood. But my family was never normal. Back in their perfectly manicured suburban Atlanta home, my parents watched the exact same terrifying news broadcasts. They saw the dramatic aerial footage of the pulverized cabins and the violently flooded valley. They saw the specific name of my medical volunteer organization listed prominently on the television screen, alongside a tragic, grim estimate of potential casualties. They had the emergency hotline numbers flashing right in front of their eyes in bright red text. They could have picked up the telephone and reported me missing in 30 seconds. They could have officially registered my name with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They could have demanded that search and rescue teams fly over the specific coordinates of my isolated base camp. They did absolutely none of those things. Not a single phone call was made. Not a single inquiry was filed. Instead of feeling a rush of parental terror, my parents felt something entirely different. They felt a surge of incredible opportunistic greed. They looked at the devastating national tragedy playing out on their television screen, and they saw a golden, unrepeatable ticket to instant wealth. Beatrice had passed away from her heart condition just 2 weeks after I left for the mountains, leaving behind her massive $6 million trust fund. The attorneys had informed the family about the specific survivorship clause. My parents knew that as long as I was breathing, every single penny of that money legally belonged to me. But a catastrophic regional landslide with dozens of unrecovered bodies buried under millions of tons of rock presented a perfect, flawless loophole. While I was manually wrapping crushed legs in torn bedsheets and starving in a damp concrete basement, my mother and father were quietly gathering my birth certificate and my social security card from their filing cabinet. They were not preparing to mount a desperate search for their youngest daughter. They were preparing to legally bury me while I was still breathing. The catastrophic storm did not just wipe out a mountain community. It gave my deeply toxic family the perfect foolproof excuse to execute the most horrific financial fraud imaginable. They chose to let me rot in the mud so they could cash a $6 million check. The sound of the rotor blades chopping through the thick mountain air was the most beautiful noise I had ever heard. It was a Tuesday morning exactly 35 days after the mountain had collapsed around us. I was boiling river water over a smoking fire pit when the first military helicopter crested the jagged tree line. The deafening thrum of the engines shook the ground. Nurses dropped their sanitized rags. The retired doctors rushed out of the concrete basement. We stood in the ankle-deep mud, waving our blistered hands at the sky and crying tears of absolute, exhausted relief. The National Guard had finally found our isolated valley. They landed in a clearing roughly a quarter mile from our decimated camp. Armed soldiers and rescue medics poured out carrying stretchers, clean water, and actual medical supplies. When a young medic wrapped a thick foil thermal blanket around my trembling shoulders and handed me a plastic bottle of purified water, I collapsed onto the wet grass. The sheer adrenaline that had kept me moving for 5 weeks suddenly evaporated. I was 28 years old, but my body felt like it was 80. I had survived the flood, the starvation, and the grueling trauma care, but the true nightmare was only just beginning. They evacuated the critical patients first. I was on the third helicopter out, flying over the unrecognizable landscape of the Appalachian Mountains. Looking down from the window, I could see the full catastrophic scale of the disaster. Entire forests were wiped clean away. Highways were buried under 50 feet of solid rock. It was a miracle anyone in our valley had survived at all. We landed at a massive regional triage center that had been set up inside a high school gymnasium in a functioning town 50 miles away. Walking into that gymnasium was a profound shock to my senses. There were bright overhead lights humming with electricity. There were hot showers, clean clothes, and folding tables stacked high with sandwiches and fresh fruit. But my priority was not food or comfort. My priority was finding a way to contact the outside world. I was absolutely desperate to call David Caldwell, my grandmother Beatrice's attorney, to find out if she was still holding on. I needed to tell her I was alive, and that her trap, whatever it was, could finally be sprung. I found a volunteer station handing out donated clothing and basic hygiene kits. I grabbed a pair of clean sweatpants and a plain gray shirt. I felt relatively human again after a hot shower, but I needed a telephone. The disaster relief workers were allowing survivors to use a bank of landline phones for 3 minutes each. The line was incredibly long. I decided to walk to a small local pharmacy across the street from the high school to buy a cheap, prepaid cellular phone and maybe some decent coffee. I still had my muddy wallet safely tucked inside my scrub pocket, holding my debit cards and my identification. I walked into the pharmacy and selected a cheap, prepaid phone, a charging cable, and a bottle of orange juice. I approached the checkout counter and handed the cashier my primary bank debit card. She swiped it through the machine. The terminal beeped an angry, sharp sound. The cashier frowned and told me it was declined. I apologized, assuming the bank had flagged the transaction for suspicious activity because I was buying electronics in a different state. I pulled out my secondary credit card and handed it to her. She swiped it. The machine beeped again. Declined. A flush of embarrassment crept up my neck. I asked her to try running it one more time. The cashier looked at the screen and shook her head. She said the system was giving her a strange error code. It was not a typical insufficient funds message. The terminal specifically said the account was locked by the issuing institution. I left the items on the counter and stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. I borrowed a cell phone from a sympathetic relief worker standing near the pharmacy entrance. I dialed the toll-free customer service number printed on the back of my debit card. I navigated the frustrating automated voice menus, typing in my account number and my social security number. The automated voice paused. Instead of giving me my account balance, the robotic voice stated that my account had been permanently frozen and transferred me to a live fraud prevention agent. A woman with a polite corporate voice answered the line. I explained that I was a disaster survivor from the Appalachian floods, and that I desperately needed access to my funds. I gave her my full name, Sarah Jenkins. I provided my date of birth and my billing address in Atlanta. The woman on the other end went completely silent for a painfully long moment. I could hear her typing rapidly on her keyboard. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its polite corporate tone. It was replaced by a strange, nervous caution. She told me she could not verify my identity. She said I needed to physically visit a local branch with legal documentation. I pleaded with her. I explained that I had just been pulled out of a mudslide after 5 weeks, and I had no money to get home. I begged her to just tell me why my account was frozen. The agent let out a heavy sigh and lowered her voice. She told me she was not supposed to disclose this over the phone, but my accounts were frozen because the primary account holder was deceased. I stopped breathing. The street noise around me completely faded away. I asked her to repeat what she had just said. The agent stated clearly that according to the federal registry tied to my social security number, Sarah Jenkins was legally dead. The bank had received official notification of mortality, and all assets were currently locked, pending probate review. I thanked her numbly and handed the phone back to the relief worker. My hands were shaking violently. I walked back into the high school gymnasium feeling like the walls were closing in around me. I approached a Federal Emergency Management Agency desk located near the bleachers. The agent behind the desk was helping survivors apply for emergency cash assistance. I sat down in the folding chair and handed the agent my muddy Georgia driver license. I asked him to run my social security number. I told him there had been a terrible administrative mistake. The agent typed my information into his secure government database. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I watched his brow furrow in deep confusion. He looked at my driver license, then looked at my face, and then looked back at the screen. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see it. Displayed in bright red letters across my official government profile was the word deceased. The file indicated that a certified death certificate had been issued by the state of Georgia just 2 weeks prior. I was 28 years old, sitting in a chair breathing the stale gymnasium air, and the federal government considered me a corpse. I felt a cold, nauseating panic rise in my throat. I asked the federal agent if I could borrow his laptop for just 2 minutes. He hesitated, but seeing the absolute terror in my eyes, he pushed the computer across the table. I opened a search browser and typed my own name, Sarah Jenkins, Atlanta, Georgia, along with the word obituary. My fingers trembled so badly I hit the wrong keys twice. When the search results populated, my heart stopped completely. The first link was an article from a prominent Atlanta local news website. The headline read, "Atlanta family mourns daughter lost in devastating Appalachian mudslide." I clicked the link. The page loaded slowly over the overloaded local network. There, staring back at me from the screen, was my own college graduation photograph. The article detailed a heartbreaking story of a brave young medical volunteer named Sarah Jenkins, who had tragically perished when her remote clinic was completely destroyed by a massive flash flood. But the details that followed made my blood turn to ice. The article stated that my grieving parents, Robert and Susan Jenkins, alongside my sister Emily, had held a beautiful somber funeral service just 4 days ago. They had buried a closed casket in our family plot at the prestigious Oakwood Cemetery. The journalist had interviewed my father. The article quoted Robert Jenkins saying that his heart was entirely shattered by the loss of his youngest daughter. It quoted my mother Susan saying she would never recover from this immense tragedy. They had set up a memorial fund in my name. The story mentioned that local authorities in the disaster zone had recovered a severely disfigured body near our coordinates, and my family had expedited the identification process through dental records to bring their precious daughter home for a proper burial. It was a complete, absolute fabrication. I was sitting right there, staring at the screen with all of my teeth perfectly intact in my head. There was no disfigured body. There was no tragic recovery. The local mountain police were overwhelmed trying to dig out entire towns. They did not have the resources to conduct complex forensic identifications on random mudslide victims in a matter of days. My parents had not waited for an official investigation. They had actively manipulated the chaos of a national disaster. They had bribed, lied, or ruthlessly pressured the overwhelmed local rural authorities into signing off on a preliminary death certificate without a shred of concrete physical proof. They had rushed back to Atlanta, purchased an expensive casket, filled it with absolutely nothing, and buried it in the ground while crying for the cameras. I scrolled further down the search results. My breathing became shallow and rapid. I typed in the name Beatrice Jenkins. The next search result hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. It was an obituary for my grandmother. Beatrice had passed away from massive heart failure exactly 14 days ago. She died exactly 3 weeks after I left for the mountains. Suddenly, the entire horrific puzzle clicked together with terrifying clarity. Every piece of their sinister plot fell perfectly into place. Beatrice was dead. She had left behind a $6 million trust fund. The attorneys would have informed the family about the specific terms of her will. They would have revealed that I was the primary beneficiary. But more importantly, they would have revealed the survivorship clause. The clause that stated, if I were to pass away, the entire $6 million fortune would legally default to my older sister Emily. My parents did not hold a funeral because they thought I was dead. They held a funeral because they needed me to be dead. When the national news reported that my volunteer camp was destroyed and communication was completely severed, they saw a golden, unprecedented opportunity. They knew I was trapped without cell service. They knew I could not call a lawyer or check my bank accounts or dispute a legal filing. While I was rationing clean water and tearing bed sheets to stop the bleeding of trapped minors, my mother and father were marching into a probate court with a fraudulent death certificate. They killed me on paper. They erased my entire existence from the legal world simply to legitimize their seizure of Beatrice's money. They assumed I would eventually be found dead in the mud. and if by some miracle I survived and walked out of those mountains weeks later, the money would already be safely transferred into Emily's bank accounts. They figured they could just claim it was a tragic misunderstanding, a premature identification born out of profound parental grief. They probably planned to use a fraction of their stolen millions to trap me in endless legal battles, forcing me to prove my own identity until I simply gave up and walked away. I sat in that folding chair in the gymnasium, staring at the photograph of my own fake funeral. The deep sorrow I had carried for 18 years, the desperate lingering hope that my parents might one day love me, evaporated completely. It was replaced by a cold, burning fury that settled deep into my bones. They had no pity for me. They had no love for me. They had looked at a catastrophic natural disaster and viewed my potential violent death as a winning lottery ticket. I handed the laptop back to the federal agent. I thanked him quietly. My voice was completely steady. I did not cry. I did not scream. I walked out of that high school gymnasium into the cool gray afternoon, feeling more alive and more dangerous than I had ever felt in my entire life. They thought I was a weak, obedient girl who would quietly disappear into the shadows. They thought they had successfully buried me in an empty box in Atlanta, but they were wrong. I was not dead. I was coming home, and I was going to burn their entire stolen empire to the ground. I pulled the borrowed cell phone from my pocket and dialed the only number I had memorized. I dialed David Caldwell, my grandmother's attorney. It was time to spring the trap Beatrice had set. It was time to resurrect the dead. This was no longer just about getting my life back. This was about absolute total destruction of their greedy, beautiful lie. The war had just begun, and I held all the ammunition. I just needed to remain a ghost a little while longer. I needed to let them spend the money they did not own. I needed to let them hang themselves with their own arrogance. I took a deep breath of the sharp mountain air, turned my face toward the road leading out of town, and began planning my return. They wanted a funeral. I was going to give them one they would never forget. But I would not be the one going into the ground. The hardest part about being legally dead is figuring out how to travel across the country when you do not exist on paper. I walked out of that high school gymnasium in the Appalachian foothills, clutching a cheap, prepaid cellular phone and exactly 84 muddy dollars in my pocket. I could not buy an airline ticket because any attempt to run my identification through federal security would immediately trigger a massive red flag in the system. I could not rent a car because my driver license was tied to a frozen dead social security number. If I walked into a local police station to declare my identity, I would be subjected to endless bureaucratic questioning. The rural authorities would immediately contact my next of kin in Atlanta. My parents would be notified before I even stepped foot in my home state. I knew with absolute certainty that if Robert and Susan Jenkins found out I had survived the mudslide, they would use every single resource at their disposal to intercept me, intercept the narrative, and twist the truth to protect their newfound wealth. So I chose to remain a ghost. I walked 3 miles down the shoulder of a rain-slicked highway until I reached a run-down regional bus depot. I paid cash for a one-way ticket heading south. The journey took 22 agonizing hours. I sat in the back corner of a crowded Greyhound bus with a faded baseball cap pulled low over my eyes, watching the jagged mountains slowly give way to the familiar, sprawling highways of Georgia. My entire body ached from 5 weeks of starvation and grueling manual labor, but my mind was completely consumed by a cold, calculating clarity. Every time the bus lurched to a halt at a dusty terminal, I replayed the digital image of my own fake funeral in my head. I thought about my mother wearing her expensive black dress, weeping theatrical tears over an empty wooden box. I thought about my sister Emily being comforted by her arrogant husband Chad, accepting the tragic condolences of our neighbors. They had not just stolen my money. They had stolen my fundamental right to exist. They had weaponized a catastrophic natural disaster to execute the most horrific financial betrayal imaginable. I knew my instinct was screaming at me to march straight up to the front door of their suburban house and kick it down. I wanted to stand in their living room and watch their smug faces contort in absolute horror as their dead daughter walked through the door, but I forced myself to suppress that desperate urge for immediate confrontation. Raging into their house would be a monumental strategic error. My parents had an enormous head start. They had official state-sanctioned death certificates. They had a compelling, tragic narrative that the entire community believed. More importantly, they now had access to millions of dollars. If I simply showed up making wild accusations, they could easily hire a team of ruthless attorneys to paint me as a deeply traumatized imposter, or a mentally unstable woman suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They could tie me up in protracted, agonizing identity verification lawsuits for years while they quietly drained every single penny from my grandmother Beatrice's accounts. I could not fight a war of emotion against people who had no conscience. I needed a bulletproof legal strategy. I needed the only person in Atlanta who actually knew the truth about my family. The bus finally pulled into downtown Atlanta on a humid Thursday morning. The city was bustling with morning commuters carrying briefcases and hot coffees, completely oblivious to the dead woman walking among them. I kept my head down and navigated the transit system until I reached the towering glass and steel architecture of the Buckhead Financial District. David Caldwell, my grandmother's personal estate attorney, operated out of a high-end law firm on the 32nd floor of a highly secure corporate building. Getting inside without a valid identification card was a terrifying hurdle. I waited near the polished marble security turnstiles, watching the endless stream of corporate employees swiping their access badges. When a large group of executives rushed through the gates, carrying boxes of catered pastries, I seamlessly blended into the middle of their group, keeping my face hidden behind the collar of my oversized jacket. I rode the crowded elevator up to the 32nd floor, my heart hammering violently against my ribs with every passing floor number. The reception area of Caldwell & Associates was an intimidating expanse of dark mahogany wood and brushed steel. The receptionist sat behind a massive curved desk answering phones with a hushed professional tone. I did not approach her. I knew the layout of the office from the secret meetings I had attended with my grandmother Beatrice years ago. I waited until the receptionist turned her back to file a stack of documents, and I slipped quietly down the main executive hallway. I reached the heavy oak door bearing David Caldwell's nameplate. I did not knock. I simply pushed down the brass handle and stepped inside, locking the door behind me with a soft, definitive click. David was standing behind his large mahogany desk, packing thick files into a leather briefcase. He looked incredibly tired. The sharp, energetic attorney I remembered from our Sunday coffee meetings looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of 5 weeks. He wore a dark morning suit, and there were deep purple circles under his eyes. He did not look up immediately, assuming I was his assistant. He told me to please hold his upcoming calls because he was heading over to the probate court for the final asset transfer. I stood completely still by the locked door and spoke his name. David froze. His hands stopped moving over his briefcase. He slowly raised his head and looked across the room. For a long, terrifying moment, the air in the office seemed to completely evaporate. The thick legal files slipped right out of his hands and crashed onto the floor, scattering dozens of papers across the expensive Persian rug. He gripped the edge of his desk, staring at me with his mouth slightly open. The color drained rapidly from his face. I pulled off my baseball cap and took a step forward into the light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I told him I was incredibly sorry for breaking into his office, but I could not use the front desk because, according to the federal government, I did not exist anymore. David let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. He stumbled around the side of his massive desk and crossed the room in 3 long strides. He grabbed my shoulders, staring intently into my eyes, searching my face as if checking for signs of a cruel hallucination. When he realized I was actually flesh and bone, he pulled me into a crushing, desperate hug. He was trembling violently. This powerful, composed attorney buried his face in my shoulder and wept openly. He kept repeating my name over and over again, thanking God that I was alive. He stepped back, wiping the tears from his face, and immediately reached for the blinds, pulling them tightly shut to obscure the windows facing the hallway. He ushered me to the leather sofa in the corner of his office and poured me a glass of water from a crystal carafe. His hands were shaking so badly, the glass clinked loudly against the table. He told me he had watched the news coverage of the Appalachian mudslides every single night. He said when the local authorities released the preliminary casualty reports, and my parents rushed back to Atlanta with a sealed casket, he felt like he had completely failed Beatrice. He had spent the last 2 weeks agonizing over my death, believing the world had lost a brilliant young woman. I took a slow sip of the cold water and asked him to explain exactly what my parents had done. I needed to understand the precise mechanics of their financial fraud. I needed to know how they managed to execute a fake funeral under the nose of a highly experienced estate lawyer. David walked over to his desk and pulled a massive red file from his locked drawer. He brought it over to the coffee table and opened it, spreading the documents out in front of me. He looked at me with an expression of profound disgust and legal outrage. He explained that Beatrice's final estate was far larger than I had ever imagined. The total value of her liquid assets, historic real estate, and diversified commercial portfolios amounted to slightly over $6 million. Beatrice had executed her final will with absolute, ruthless precision. She had specifically and explicitly disinherited her son Robert and her daughter-in-law Susan. She had included ironclad language barring them from accessing a single penny of her wealth, citing their years of financial irresponsibility and their cruel abandonment of her youngest granddaughter. The entire $6 million trust was legally designated to transfer 100% into my name the moment the probate period cleared. But David pointed a shaking finger at a specific paragraph buried deep on the 7th page of the trust document. It was a standard legal provision known as a survivorship clause. Beatrice had naturally assumed that given the natural order of life, I would outlive her by decades. However, the law requires contingencies. The clause stated that in the highly unlikely event that I predeceased my grandmother, or passed away before the estate could be formally settled, the entire trust bypasses my parents entirely and defaults to the only other living blood relative. It defaults to my older sister Emily. The horrifying brilliance of my parents' scheme instantly snapped into focus. Robert and Susan Jenkins knew they could never legally touch the money themselves. Beatrice had blocked them perfectly. But Emily was incredibly weak-willed, fiercely loyal to my mother, and entirely dependent on our parents' approval to fund her glamorous lifestyle with Chad. If Emily inherited the $6 million, my parents effectively inherited the $6 million. They would move into Emily's massive new mansion. They would have unrestricted access to her joint bank accounts. They would finally achieve the elite high society status they had craved their entire miserable lives. David explained that when Beatrice passed away, he immediately notified the family of the will's contents as required by law. My parents were furious when they realized they were completely cut out. But just a few days later, the massive storm wiped my volunteer camp off the map. When the communication lines went down, and the national news began broadcasting estimates of the dead, my parents saw their ultimate loophole. They traveled to the disaster zone immediately, David said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. They bypassed the overwhelmed federal emergency agencies and went straight to the chaotic rural county coroner. They claimed they had definitive dental records proving that one of the unidentifiable victims recovered from the mudslide was their beloved daughter, Sarah. In the middle of a catastrophic regional emergency, with hundreds of bodies being pulled from the wreckage, the rural authorities simply did not have the time or the forensic infrastructure to challenge a grieving wealthy family offering immediate positive identification. The coroner signed the preliminary death certificate. They sealed a casket packed with nothing but rocks and dirt, shipped it back to Atlanta, and buried it in the ground before anyone could ask any difficult questions. I asked David why he did not stop the probate process. I asked him how a judge could possibly release the funds without a thorough investigation. David ran a frustrated hand over his face. He told me he fought them with everything he had. He filed emergency injunctions demanding independent investigations into the remains. He tried to delay the asset transfer citing suspicious circumstances. But my parents had hired a team of incredibly aggressive, high-priced litigators using personal loans backed by their anticipated inheritance. They presented the judge with a state-certified death certificate, an official coroner report, and highly publicized news articles featuring their tearful public mourning. The judge reprimanded David for causing unnecessary distress to a grieving family and ordered the immediate execution of the survivorship clause. The trust was currently in the mandatory holding period, but it was scheduled to be fully unlocked and transferred into Emily's bank accounts in less than 3 weeks. I felt a cold, dangerous anger settle deeply into my chest. I looked at David and told him I wanted to march into the police station right now. I wanted to hand over my fingerprints, prove my identity, and have my parents arrested for fraud by the end of the day. David immediately held up his hand, stopping me. He leaned forward and his voice shifted back into the sharp, brilliant legal strategist my grandmother had trusted with her empire. He told me that if I walked into a police station today, I would trigger a massive, chaotic jurisdictional nightmare. The police would launch an investigation spanning 2 different states. The federal government would get involved due to the fraudulent emergency claims. My parents would instantly play the victims. They would go on television crying and claiming they made a terrible innocent mistake out of profound grief. They would argue that the rural coroner misled them. They would use the millions they were already borrowing against the trust to hire criminal defense attorneys who specialize in muddying the waters. The legal battle would drag on for years, and the $6 million estate would be completely frozen or entirely eaten up by legal fees. David looked me straight in the eyes. He told me that Beatrice had not sent me to the mountains just to hide. She had sent me there to let my parents step entirely into the snare. He explained that my parents had committed a monumental crime, but to truly destroy them, we needed them to act on that crime. We needed them to spend the money. We needed them to sign the fraudulent loan documents. We needed them to completely incriminate themselves beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt. He said we could not just prove that I was alive. We had to prove that they knew exactly what they were doing, and we had to drop the anvil on their heads in front of a federal judge in a way they could never escape. I sat back on the leather sofa, digesting the massive weight of his legal strategy. The urge to scream at my mother was overwhelming, but the desire for absolute inescapable justice was infinitely stronger. I realized that my survival was not enough. I had to become the architect of their total destruction. I looked at David Caldwell and I nodded. I agreed to remain a ghost. I agreed to stay dead in the eyes of the law while we gathered the ammunition necessary to blow their stolen lives to pieces. Living as a legally deceased person in the modern world is an incredibly surreal and isolating experience. Under the strict advice of my grandmother's estate attorney, David Caldwell, I moved into a nondescript extended-stay motel on the industrial outskirts of Atlanta. I paid for my room and my modest meals using a stack of crisp $100 bills David had provided from a secure contingency account my grandmother Beatrice had established years prior. I could not use my debit cards. I could not log into my personal email accounts. I could not even use my real name to order a simple cup of black coffee at the corner diner. Every single morning I woke up in that sterile beige motel room, staring at the popcorn ceiling and processing the terrifying reality that the state of Georgia officially considered me buried 6 feet under the pristine green grass of Oakwood Cemetery. The psychological toll of total erasure is profoundly heavy. There were quiet hours in the middle of the night when the absolute isolation threatened to crush me. I missed the comfortable predictability of my own apartment. I missed my demanding routine at the regional hospital, but every single time the creeping loneliness began to penetrate my mind, I would force myself to remember the digital image of my mother acting the part of the devastated parent on the evening news. I would remind myself that my parents and my sister Emily had willingly traded my life for a $6 million payout. That staggering, monumental betrayal acted like a permanent brace against my spine, keeping me perfectly straight and focused. I was a medical billing specialist. I had spent my entire professional career tracking down hidden administrative codes, analyzing incredibly complex financial trails, and finding the hard truth buried under mountains of bureaucratic paperwork. Now I was going to use those exact same skills to dissect my own family. I knew I could not dismantle their flawless, tragic narrative entirely on my own. I needed professional tactical assistance to gather irrefutable evidence without accidentally alerting my parents that I was secretly building a massive legal case against them. 2 days after my secret meeting with David Caldwell, he introduced me to a private investigator named Thomas Mitchell. Thomas was a retired state fraud investigator with a sharp analytical mind and a profound, deep-seated distaste for financial predators. We met in the back corner of a dimly lit restaurant where Thomas laid out our surveillance strategy over a cup of black coffee. I told him absolutely everything about Emily and her arrogant husband Chad. I explained their relentless greed, my mother's absolute obsession with high society status, and my father's weak moral spine. I needed Thomas to become my eyes and ears. In the affluent suburban neighborhoods I could no longer safely enter without risking exposure. Thomas immediately went to work. He parked his unmarked vehicle outside my parents' home and trailed Emily and Chad through their daily routines. He documented their physical movements, their lavish shopping trips, and their celebratory champagne dinners. Meanwhile, I turned my cheap motel room into a highly secure makeshift command center. I purchased a secondary laptop with the cash David provided and connected to the public wireless internet using a secure anonymous proxy network to mask my location. I applied my years of rigorous accounting experience to the vast web of public municipal records. My parents thought they were incredibly clever, but they completely underestimated the digital footprints left behind by massive, arrogant financial maneuvers. I accessed the county probate court dockets and carefully reviewed the exact timeline of their legal filings. The dates told a story of absolute chilling premeditation. The catastrophic flash flood in the Appalachian Mountains occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. The rural emergency management agencies did not even issue their preliminary list of missing persons until Thursday morning. Yet, according to the unalterable digital timestamp on the official court filings, my father had submitted an expedited request for a presumptive death certificate by Friday afternoon. They had not waited for a search and rescue team to clear the muddy rubble. They had not organized a volunteer search party or hired private helicopters. They had immediately bribed or heavily pressured an overwhelmed regional coroner to declare me legally dead before the mountain mud had even begun to dry. They needed that specific government document to unlock Beatrice's trust fund, and they moved with the ruthless, calculated efficiency of corporate sharks. I dug even deeper into the county property records and discovered something that made my blood run completely cold. I found a massive bridge loan that Chad had applied for just 3 days after my fake funeral. A bridge loan is a short-term, extremely high-interest financing option used in commercial real estate when a buyer needs immediate cash before a larger financial payout clears. The banking paperwork showed he had used the impending trust disbursement as absolute collateral. He had literally submitted my fraudulent death certificate to a major banking institution to secure a luxury home purchase. Chad had initiated a preliminary transfer request for a spectacular newly constructed mansion in an exclusive gated community on the north side of the city. They were operating under the absolute certainty that millions of dollars would be deposited into Emily's checking account within a matter of days. As an accountant, I knew that this kind of reckless financial velocity required absolute arrogant confidence. They were borrowing massive sums of money against their anticipated inheritance, living like royalty on the assumption that my grave was permanently sealed. Every digital document I uncovered, every expedited form they filed, was another heavy nail in their legal coffin. But paper trails and digital footprints only proved their greed and their financial intent. We needed something visceral. We needed concrete, undeniable audio and visual proof of their malicious intent. We needed the federal probate court to see the absolute complete lack of human empathy hiding behind their expensive mourning clothes. The major breakthrough came entirely by accident, proving that careless, arrogant people always make fatal, unforced mistakes. It was late Thursday evening when Thomas Mitchell called David Caldwell on a secure line and told us to come to his private office immediately. When we arrived, Thomas was sitting at his computer monitor with a grim, highly satisfied expression on his weathered face. He explained that he had been canvassing the quiet, upscale street directly across from the luxury funeral home, where my parents had staged my memorial service earlier that week. Thomas had noticed that a neighbor living directly opposite the funeral home parking lot owned a high-end electric vehicle equipped with a highly sensitive motion-activated security camera system. Thomas explained the technology to us. Whenever motion was detected near the vehicle, the car's exterior cameras automatically began recording high-definition video and audio to a secure internal hard drive. The neighbor had parked directly across from the funeral home entrance because street parking was completely full that day. The heavily publicized funeral of a young medical volunteer had drawn a massive crowd of sympathetic community members and local journalists. The car's cameras captured every single person exiting the building. Thomas had knocked on the neighbor's door posed as an insurance claims adjuster investigating a minor traffic collision, and successfully requested copies of the security footage from the afternoon of my fake funeral. He specifically isolated the footage from 45 minutes after the memorial service officially ended, and the news vans had finally driven away. Thomas clicked his computer mouse and pulled up a high-definition video file on the large flat-screen monitor mounted on his office wall. The camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the funeral home's elegant, manicured exit. I stood silently next to David Caldwell and watched the digital recording of my own burial reception. The footage initially showed my mother and father walking out of the heavy wooden doors, dabbing their eyes with white handkerchiefs, as they spoke to a lingering local news reporter. They played their tragic parts flawlessly. My father looked somber and broken, staring at the ground. My mother leaned heavily against his shoulder, acting as though the grief of losing her youngest daughter was physically unbearable to stand. But the security camera kept rolling long after the reporter packed up his microphone and drove away. The crowd of sympathetic mourners slowly dispersed, leaving only my immediate family standing near their parked luxury cars. I watched my sister Emily step out of the shadow of the funeral home awning, accompanied by her husband Chad. They looked around the quiet street. They thought the parking lot was completely empty. They thought absolutely nobody was watching them. The high-definition security camera possessed a highly sensitive directional microphone designed to pick up street noise and approaching footsteps. The audio was slightly muffled by a gentle passing wind, but their cruel, arrogant words were unmistakably clear. I watched Chad loosen his expensive black silk tie and let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. He leaned against the polished hood of my father's car and actually laughed. It was not a quiet, subtle chuckle. It was a hysterical, booming laugh of pure, unrestrained victory. Emily swatted his arm playfully, but a massive, beaming smile broke across her meticulously made-up face, destroying any illusion of a grieving sister. Then Chad spoke the exact words that would be burned into my memory for the rest of my natural life. He looked directly at my mother, who had completely dropped her weeping facade and was now aggressively checking her luxury wristwatch, complaining about the time. Chad shook his head in absolute amusement and said the landslide was truly a stroke of luck. With the death certificate issued so quickly, the $6 million will be dispersed next week. Emily giggled like a schoolgirl who had just gotten away with a brilliant, elaborate prank. She wrapped her arms around Chad's neck and replied, saying she could not wait to start decorating the massive new mansion they had just secured. My mother simply nodded, smoothing her expensive black dress, and reminded them both to keep their voices down until they were safely inside the privacy of their own vehicle. There was absolutely no sorrow on that street. There was no tragedy. There was only a family of sociopathic predators openly celebrating a massive financial victory over my imaginary grave. I stood in Thomas Mitchell's office, completely paralyzed, as the video clip looped and played a second time. I heard the cruel, booming laughter echo from the computer speakers again. For 18 years, I had carried the heavy, crushing burden of believing I was the fundamental problem in my family. I had spent my entire childhood trying to make myself useful, trying desperately to earn even a fraction of the love they poured so effortlessly onto my sister. Even after they threw me onto the street like a bag of garbage, I had still secretly harbored a tiny, pathetic sliver of hope that somewhere deep down, they still viewed me as their daughter. I thought that maybe, just maybe, my tragic premature death in a terrifying natural disaster would finally force them to realize they had made a terrible mistake. I honestly thought genuine grief might finally humble them. Watching that security footage completely shattered the final remaining illusion I held about my blood relatives. I had spent years in therapy trying to untangle the complex web of family guilt, but in a matter of seconds, that video cured me forever. The agonizing pain of their lifelong rejection did not just fade away. It evaporated into thin air, instantly replaced by a deep, calculating, absolute coldness. Their profound cruelty completely numbed my heart, but it completely sharpened my mind. I realized in that quiet office that I was mourning a family that simply never existed. They were entirely hollow inside. They were completely devoid of human empathy. They viewed my life as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle standing between them and a life of absolute luxury. The only language they understood was money and consequence. I turned away from the computer screen and looked at David Caldwell. The seasoned estate attorney looked physically nauseated by what he had just witnessed. He placed a hand on his desk to steady himself and asked me in a quiet voice if I was all right. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound, incredible shift happening inside my soul. I was no longer the frightened 18-year-old girl crying on a dark porch holding 2 garbage bags. I was no longer the invisible sister wearing hand-me-down clothes. I was a highly educated financial professional holding absolute, irrefutable proof of a massive, coordinated federal crime. I looked at David and told him that I was more than all right. I told him I was absolutely ready to destroy them. The fear and the hesitation that had kept me hiding in the shadows completely disappeared. I asked Thomas to make multiple highly secure encrypted copies of the dashcam footage. I asked David to prepare the official trust documents, the forensic financial reports, the bridge loan applications, and every single piece of evidence we had meticulously gathered over the past few weeks. My parents and my sister thought they had successfully manipulated the probate court. They thought they had outsmarted my grandmother Beatrice and secured their glorious, wealthy future. They were currently sleeping in their expensive beds, completely unaware that their dead daughter was awake, working through the night, and building a perfect, inescapable prison for them. The grief was entirely gone. I had transformed from a forgotten victim into an unforgiving warrior. We had the financial motive. We had the irrefutable paper trail. We had the video confession. The shadows had served their purpose, allowing me to gather my weapons in absolute silence. Now it was time to step into the blinding light of the courtroom and let the heavy hammer of justice fall. The legal system moves with agonizing slowness, especially when dealing with a $6 million estate. Probate court is not a fast food drive-through. It requires meticulous documentation, extensive verification, and a mandatory waiting period to ensure all debts and claims against the deceased are properly settled. My grandmother Beatrice knew this better than anyone. Her attorney, David Caldwell, certainly knew this, and as a medical billing specialist who spent years untangling bureaucratic red tape, I absolutely knew this. But my parents and my sister Emily possessed a highly dangerous combination of unbridled greed and severe financial impatience. They had successfully filed my fraudulent death certificate and convinced the local authorities I was buried under a mountain of mud, but the actual cash from Beatrice's massive trust fund was legally locked behind a thick bureaucratic wall for at least 45 days. For people accustomed to instant gratification and driven by a desperate desire for high society status, 45 days might as well have been an eternity. This is where the arrogance of Emily's husband Chad became their ultimate downfall. Chad worked as a real estate broker. He understood exactly how to leverage anticipated assets to generate immediate cash flow. Working from the absolute isolation of my sterile motel room, I reviewed the financial surveillance reports that my private investigator Thomas Mitchell delivered every single evening. The documents showed exactly how my family decided to bypass the frustrating probate waiting period. Chad had approached a private lending firm that specialized in high-risk short-term financing. He presented them with my official expedited death certificate, a certified copy of Beatrice's will highlighting the specific survivorship clause, and the initial probate court filing confirming his wife Emily as the default legal beneficiary. Based entirely on the absolute, unquestionable certainty of my tragic demise, the firm approved a massive commercial bridge loan. They borrowed $2.5 million at an outrageously exorbitant interest rate. The collateral for this staggering sum of money was the impending trust disbursement. They literally mortgaged my blood and my bones. They traded the legal fiction of my crushed corpse for a massive injection of immediate liquid cash. The sheer sociopathic audacity of that specific financial transaction still makes my stomach turn every time I think about it. They were essentially cashing out my life insurance policy before the ink on my death certificate was even dry. They did not pause to mourn. They did not hesitate. They just signed the papers and took the money. With $2.5 million sitting heavily in their newly minted joint accounts, the Jenkins family did not retreat into the quiet privacy of mourning. They went on a spectacular, unchecked, and entirely grotesque spending spree. Thomas Mitchell followed them discreetly across the city, capturing high-definition surveillance photographs of their rampant consumption. I sat on my uncomfortable motel bed night after night, staring at images of my mother Susan and my sister Emily, sipping expensive champagne in exclusive designer boutiques. They purchased a stunning, newly constructed 7-bedroom mansion in a highly secure gated community in the wealthy northern suburbs of Atlanta. The county property records Thomas pulled showed a purchase price of $1.8 million paid entirely in cash, directly from the bridge loan account. The excessive spending did not stop at real estate. My father, Robert, a man who had once bitterly complained about the modest cost of my community college textbooks, walked into a high-end luxury car dealership, and drove out in a brand-new, fully loaded Porsche Cayenne. Chad and Emily upgraded their lifestyle immediately, purchasing a pristine white Mercedes SUV with custom leather interiors. They hired elite interior decorators to furnish the massive new mansion with imported Italian furniture, modern art pieces, and custom crystal chandeliers. They lived exactly like lottery winners, completely intoxicated by their sudden, unearned elevation into the wealthy elite class they had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress. The most nauseating piece of evidence Thomas provided was a series of photographs from a lavish, catered event they hosted at their sprawling new estate. It was ostensibly a gathering to celebrate Emily and Chad's new home, but the undertone of the evening was pure, unfiltered victory. White-gloved caterers carried silver trays of expensive caviar and imported wine. A professional string quartet played classical music on the perfectly manicured back lawn. Through the powerful zoom lens of Thomas's surveillance camera, I watched my mother laughing uproariously with her affluent new neighbors. She was holding a martini glass, dripping in newly purchased diamond jewelry, wearing a spectacular designer dress. There was absolutely no shadow of grief on her face. There was no quiet moment of reflection. There was no empty chair left at the table for the youngest daughter she had buried in an empty box just a few weeks prior. They were literally dancing on my grave, completely unaware that the grave they were celebrating was entirely empty. But the beautiful and terrifying reality of high-risk bridge loans is that private lenders are not known for their patience or their mercy. A bridge loan is specifically designed to be a temporary financial bandage, not a permanent wealth solution. As the weeks dragged on, the exorbitant daily interest rates began to compound at a frightening pace. The private lending firm had given Chad a strict 90-day window to repay the principal amount, plus a staggering accumulation of interest, fully expecting the probate court to release Beatrice's $6 million trust funds long before the final deadline arrived. What my parents and Chad did not account for was the deliberate, masterful, and entirely legal stalling tactics of David Caldwell. As the named executor of Beatrice's massive estate, David had incredible legal latitude to dictate the exact pace of the probate proceedings. Operating under my strict instructions, he filed endless requests for mundane procedural reviews. He requested additional time from the court to thoroughly audit Beatrice's complex commercial property portfolio. He demanded perfectly formatted tax clearances from the State Revenue Department before he would move forward. Every single motion he filed was entirely legal and standard practice for an estate of that size, but each calculated maneuver pushed the final disbursement date back by a few more critical days. As the end of the first month rapidly approached the initial thrilling intoxication of the mansion, and the luxury cars began to curdle into intense, suffocating financial anxiety, the private lending firm started sending aggressive legal notices, demanding immediate proof of the impending trust payout. The bank wanted their money, and my parents simply did not have a single dollar left to give them. The initial $2.5 million was already completely gone, sunk permanently into illiquid real estate, rapidly depreciating luxury vehicles, and non-refundable custom designer furniture. They were completely and terrifyingly leveraged. They were standing on a fragile, crumbling trapdoor of massive debt, and the aggressive private bank was explicitly threatening to pull the lever. The mounting financial pressure transformed my parents from grieving wealthy victims into furious, demanding tyrants. They began calling David Caldwell's law office incessantly. At first, the daily phone calls were merely urgent, with my father asking for simple timeline updates and offering to help speed up the paperwork. Then, as the lending firm's demands grew significantly louder and more threatening, my mother's tone shifted to outright hostility. Thomas captured disturbing footage of my father violently pacing the sidewalk outside David's corporate office building, his face red with panic, screaming desperately into his cell phone. David expertly recorded every single interaction, meticulously building an impenetrable wall of evidence regarding their volatile state of mind and their desperate financial intent. During one particularly unhinged phone call, which I listened to in real time from the absolute safety of David's office speakerphone, my mother Susan completely lost her temper. She shrieked through the audio receiver, demanding that David stop dragging his feet and do his job. She aggressively accused him of trying to steal the estate's money through extended legal billing fees. She screamed that Emily was the rightful indisputable heir, that I was tragically gone forever, and that there was absolutely no legal or moral reason for the probate judge to withhold their $6 million any longer. Her voice grew incredibly shrill as she commanded David to schedule the final probate distribution hearing immediately. She threatened to report his law firm to the State Bar Association and ruin his professional reputation if he delayed the legal process by one more single day. She claimed her family had suffered enough tragedy and demanded the financial closure they rightfully deserved. David handled her aggressive, panicked threats with the calm, soothing tone of a seasoned professional guiding a volatile, dangerous animal right into a steel cage. He apologized profusely for the bureaucratic delays. He assured her that he completely understood her profound frustration and the emotional toll the waiting period was taking on her family. And then, with perfect, practiced reluctance, he told my mother exactly what she desperately wanted to hear. He sighed deeply into the phone and agreed to formally petition the probate judge for an expedited asset distribution hearing by the end of the week. My mother let out a loud, triumphant huff of air and hung up the phone without thanking him. She was absolutely certain she had successfully bullied the old estate lawyer into submission. She believed her aggressive tactics had won the day and secured her stolen fortune. She had absolutely no idea she had just forcefully demanded the exact date and time of her own total destruction. By forcing the court hearing, they had woven their own rope, tied the knot with their own hands, and placed it securely around their own necks. They had deliberately put themselves in a legal noose from which there was absolutely no escape. All I had to do now was walk into that courtroom, look them dead in the eye, and gladly kick away the chair. I sat in the heavy leather chair in David Caldwell's office, listening to the steady drumming of rain against the thick glass windows. It had been nearly 4 weeks since I returned from the Appalachian mudslides. 4 weeks of living like a phantom in a cheap motel, while my parents paraded around Atlanta in luxury cars bought with my stolen life. David sat across the mahogany desk, organizing a neat stack of legal documents. A profound sense of anticipation filled the quiet room. We had tracked their extravagant spending. We had documented their massive, fraudulent bridge loan. We had captured their cruel laughter on surveillance footage. But David told me we needed one final piece to guarantee their absolute destruction. He smiled a tight, determined smile and told me it was time to show me my grandmother Beatrice's ultimate weapon. David led me down a long, carpeted hallway to a secure, windowless conference room at the back of the law firm. There were no decorative plants or plush sofas here. It was a sterile, practical space. Just a large conference table, a sophisticated audiovisual system, and a heavy steel door that locked securely behind us. He motioned for me to sit at the center of the table while he picked up a sleek black remote control. He explained that my grandmother was a woman who never left anything to chance. She had built a massive commercial real estate empire in a time when women were rarely welcomed in corporate boardrooms. She knew exactly how aggressive corporate attorneys operated, and she knew that a standard paper could always be contested in probate court by desperate people with expensive lawyers. My parents were currently proving her right by challenging the execution of the trust and trying to force an early disbursement through the judge. But Beatrice had anticipated their exact legal maneuvering. She knew they would try to claim she was not of sound mind, or that I had somehow manipulated her in her final days. To counter their inevitable lies, she did not just leave a written document. She left a highly confidential, legally binding video recording. David pressed a button on the remote, and the large screen mounted on the wall flickered to life. I felt a massive, heavy lump form in my throat the absolute moment her face appeared. It was Beatrice sitting in the very same leather chair I had occupied in David's office just minutes ago. She was wearing her favorite emerald green silk blouse. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her posture was impeccably straight, despite the illness that was slowly claiming her failing heart. The digital recording was time-stamped just 3 weeks before her passing. Seeing her moving and speaking felt like receiving an unexpected, terrifying gift from the universe. I gripped the edge of the polished conference table to stop my hands from visibly shaking. Beatrice looked directly into the camera lens with piercing, unwavering authority. She stated her full legal name, the exact date, and her explicit intention to record her final testamentary wishes. Then her tone shifted from standard legal formality to a chilling, deeply personal warning. She spoke directly to my parents, as if they were sitting right there, in the room with her. She said, "Robert and Susan, if you are watching this video in a courtroom, it means you have decided to contest my written will. It means you are attempting to steal the legacy I specifically, intentionally, and happily left to your youngest daughter, Sarah." I watched my grandmother take a slow, steady breath on the large screen. She continued speaking with absolute surgical precision. She detailed their decades of profound financial irresponsibility. She talked about the absurd luxury cars they bought for Emily while I was scrubbing diner floors to survive. She outlined the horrific night they threw me onto the street because I bravely refused to empty my savings account to pay for my sister's reckless credit card debt. Beatrice looked right into the camera and said, "I know exactly who you are. I know you view my death as an unearned payday. I know you view Sarah as an inconvenient obstacle. I am recording this video to look the probate judge in the eye and confirm that I am of perfectly sound mind. And I am deliberately cutting you out of my estate because you are entirely morally bankrupt." But the most devastating part of the video was yet to come. Beatrice leaned slightly closer to the camera. Her voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper that commanded total attention. She said, "I have instructed Sarah to leave the state for a medical volunteer trip in a remote, mountainous location, specifically so she would be completely unreachable during my final days. I did this to protect her from you. I did this because I knew that if you had the opportunity, you would try to silence her, manipulate her, or remove her from the equation entirely. If you have come to this court claiming that Sarah is missing or incapacitated, or worse, if you have somehow manufactured a fraudulent claim that she is no longer alive, you have fallen directly into my trap. Sarah is alive. She is my sole heir, and you have just committed monumental perjury." The screen faded silently to black. I sat in the dark conference room, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her brilliant foresight. Beatrice had known. She had looked at her own son and realized he was capable of truly monstrous things. She had purposely orchestrated my absence, not just to keep me physically safe, but to give my greedy family enough rope to completely hang themselves. David turned the overhead lights back on. He handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I wiped the tears streaming down my face. I was crying for the profound, beautiful love my grandmother had shown me, and for the absolute tragedy of a family so deeply broken that a dying woman had to lay a criminal trap for her own child. David gently touched my arm and told me we needed to focus. The video was a masterpiece of legal evidence, but we could not simply walk into the probate hearing unprepared and hope for the best. My parents had used a certified state death certificate to secure a massive commercial bridge loan. We were no longer dealing with a simple family dispute over a wealthy inheritance. We were dealing with a massive multi-million-dollar federal crime. David outlined our strict legal strategy for the upcoming hearing. He explained that when arrogant people are backed into a corner and caught in a massive, devastating lie, they do not simply apologize and surrender. They furiously double down. If I just walked into the courtroom, my parents would immediately claim I was an imposter. They would argue that the real Sarah Jenkins had died tragically in the Appalachian mudslide, and that I was a brilliant con artist hired by someone to steal their rightful inheritance. They had millions of dollars in borrowed bank money on the line. They would fight with the vicious, irrational desperation of trapped animals. To permanently counter this predictable strategy, we needed absolute, undeniable proof of my identity. We needed a towering mountain of biometric and historical data that no expensive, aggressive defense attorney could ever possibly dispute. For the next 3 days, I treated my own identity like a complex forensic medical audit. I visited a highly secure, independent biometric testing facility to have my fingerprints officially scanned and legally certified against government databases. We formally requested my original birth records from the state Vital Statistics Archives. I contacted my childhood dentist, who still operated a small private practice in suburban Atlanta. He remembered me perfectly because I used to pay for my own dental cleanings with wrinkled cash from my diner job. He gladly provided my original dental x-rays and signed a sworn, legally binding affidavit verifying my physical identity. I also gathered my extensive employment records from the hospital where I worked as a medical billing specialist, including my annual tax documents and my original employee identification badge. Every single piece of paper was professionally notarized and sealed into a heavy leather binder by David's dedicated legal team. We were methodically building an impenetrable fortress of truth to permanently crush their fragile structure of lies. But simply proving I was alive was only half the battle. The other half was ensuring my parents and Emily's arrogant husband Chad faced the absolute maximum legal consequences for their horrific actions. Mortgaging a fraudulent death certificate to secure a $2.5 million bridge loan from a federally insured banking institution instantly elevated their actions from state-level fraud to federal wire fraud and severe bank fraud. David had quietly reached out to a highly trusted contact within the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because the crime crossed state lines regarding the National Disaster Declaration and directly involved a federally regulated commercial lender, the federal agency was highly motivated to immediately intervene. On Tuesday morning, exactly 2 days before the scheduled probate hearing, David and I sat in his secure conference room with 2 serious federal agents. I slid crisp copies of the fraudulent death certificate, the commercial bridge loan applications, and the high-definition surveillance photographs of my parents throwing lavish celebrations at their new million-dollar mansion across the wooden table. The agents reviewed the documents with quiet, professional intensity. I calmly explained how my family had abandoned me at 18, how they had locked me out of the hospital when Beatrice was dying, and how they had utilized a catastrophic natural disaster to expedite a fake funeral. I handed the federal agents the detailed financial timeline I had built. I showed them the exact hour the commercial loan was approved based entirely on the false premise of my accidental death. The senior agent closed the thick file and looked at me with a hard, uncompromising expression of pure respect. He told me that my accounting background had made their job incredibly easy. He confirmed that the financial evidence was absolutely overwhelming. Right there in the conference room, they began drafting a comprehensive federal arrest warrant for Robert Jenkins, Susan Jenkins, Emily Harrison, and Chad Harrison on multiple severe counts of criminal conspiracy, massive identity theft, and federal bank fraud. The night before the probate hearing, I sat alone in my dark motel room, staring out the window at the distant, glowing city lights of Atlanta. The sheer, terrifying weight of what was about to happen tomorrow morning settled heavily onto my tired shoulders. Somewhere out there, in a massive, exclusive, gated community, my parents were sleeping comfortably in a multi-million-dollar mansion they did not legally own. They were probably dreaming about the final court approval tomorrow that would make them legitimately rich. They were likely planning their next extravagant luxury vacation, completely convinced that they had outsmarted the legal system and buried their unwanted daughter forever. I turned away from the window and looked at the closet door. I had picked up my polished, tailored white suit from the dry cleaning bag earlier that afternoon. I had chosen the color white completely deliberately. I did not want to walk into that courthouse looking like a grim, dark ghost returning from the grave to haunt them. I wanted to look like a living, breathing, victorious professional woman who was about to dismantle their entire fraudulent world brick by stolen brick. I zipped the plastic suit bag shut and carefully set my digital alarm clock for the morning. The long, painful mourning period was officially over. Tomorrow, the absolute reckoning would finally begin. The morning of the final probate hearing felt entirely different from any other day of my existence. I was standing quietly inside a small, windowless consultation room on the second floor of the downtown Atlanta courthouse. 2 stern federal agents from the white-collar crime division stood silently beside me, with their arms crossed over their dark suits. Through a slightly cracked side door, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the main probate courtroom. I was wearing the pristine, tailored white suit I had carefully laid out the night before. My heart was pounding a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I was not nervous. I was not afraid. I was experiencing the profound, terrifying calm that comes right before a massive, unavoidable storm finally breaks. The main courtroom was an intimidating space designed to make people feel small. It featured high vaulted ceilings, heavy oak paneling, and long rows of polished wooden benches. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy double doors at the back of the gallery swung open. I held my breath as my biological family walked down the center aisle. The visual contrast between their supposed overwhelming grief and their actual wardrobe was absolutely staggering. My mother, Susan, led the procession. She wore a tailored black designer dress that probably cost more than my first car. She had draped a delicate black silk scarf over her shoulders, and she was clutching a crumpled white tissue in her trembling hand. My father, Robert, walked closely beside her, wearing a custom-fitted charcoal suit that screamed of newly acquired wealth. My sister, Emily, followed them, leaning heavily on her arrogant husband, Chad. Emily was wearing oversized, dark designer sunglasses indoors, pushing them up onto her perfectly styled blonde hair as she took her seat at the front table. They did not look like a family destroyed by a tragic natural disaster. They looked like royalty, attending a state funeral. They looked wealthy, arrogant, and entirely untouchable. They arranged themselves at the petitioner's table with practiced, calculated precision. Whenever the court clerk or the bailiff looked their way, my mother would dab at her perfectly dry eyes with her tissue. She would let out a soft, fragile sigh designed to elicit immediate sympathy from anyone within earshot. Chad subtly checked his luxury gold watch, clearly annoyed that the legal process of becoming a millionaire was taking up his valuable morning. They whispered to each other, not words of comfort or shared sorrow, but hurried logistical confirmations. They were utterly confident in their victory. They had the fraudulent death certificate safely filed with the county. They had the backing of their expensive, aggressive private litigator, who sat beside them organizing his neat stacks of paper. They believed this hearing was nothing more than a minor administrative hurdle, a final rubber stamp before Beatrice's massive $6 million trust fund was permanently unlocked and transferred into their waiting hands. At 9:15, the bailiff announced the arrival of the presiding judge. The entire courtroom stood in respectful silence. The judge, a stern-looking man with silver hair and a deeply lined face, took his seat at the high, elevated wooden bench. He opened the massive, thick file folder bearing my grandmother Beatrice's estate number. He looked down at my family with an expression of genuine judicial sympathy. Before officially reading the docket, he paused and offered his formal, heartfelt condolences for their recent double tragedy. He spoke softly about the terrible burden of losing both a respected family matriarch and a young, vibrant daughter in such a devastatingly short span of time. Watching my mother accept those judicial condolences from my hidden vantage point was physically nauseating. She bowed her head, letting her shoulders shake slightly. She let out a fragile, practiced whimper and whispered a quiet, tearful thank you to the judge. My father placed a comforting hand on her back, playing the role of the strong, silent patriarch supporting his broken wife. The sheer sociopathic audacity of their performance made the air in my lungs turn to ice. They were accepting sympathy for a dead child while eagerly waiting to cash the check that my death provided. The legal proceedings officially began. Their newly hired high-priced litigator stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached the wooden podium facing the judge. He cleared his throat and began spinning a masterful, heartbreaking narrative for the court record. He spoke eloquently about the devastating Appalachian mudslides that had gripped the national news cycle. He painted a vivid, heroic picture of a brave young medical volunteer, meaning me, who had tragically sacrificed her life to help isolated mountain communities. He spoke about the unbearable, crushing grief my parents were enduring night after night. With absolute, unblinking confidence, the attorney presented the expedited state-certified death certificate to the court clerk, sliding the fraudulent piece of paper across the polished wood. He explained the specific mechanics of Beatrice's trust fund to the judge. He pointed directly to the survivorship clause, clearly highlighted in yellow ink. He formally petitioned the court to officially bypass the deceased primary beneficiary and permanently release the entire $6 million estate to the surviving sister Emily Harrison. He argued that the family had suffered enough financial and emotional distress, and that delaying the disbursement any further would only compound their horrific tragedy. The judge nodded slowly, reviewing the submitted paperwork with a careful eye. Everything looked completely legitimate on the surface. The documents were properly stamped. The legal arguments were sound. He looked over his reading glasses at my parents sitting closely together at the table. He asked if the family wished to make a brief personal statement for the official court record before he issued his final ruling on the asset distribution. My mother did not hesitate for a single second. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She slowly stood up, placing one trembling, manicured hand on the wooden table for support. It was a spectacular, Oscar-worthy performance that would have fooled anyone who did not know the dark, toxic truth She spoke in a breathless, fragile whisper that echoed perfectly through the silent courtroom. She told the judge that losing her youngest daughter was the absolute hardest thing she had ever endured in her entire life. She claimed that our family was incredibly close and loving. She looked the judge right in the eye and stated that I was the absolute light of her life. She forced a single, perfectly timed tear to roll down her cheek as she explained how much she missed my smile and my laugh. Then she masterfully pivoted to the money. She told the court that the only thing keeping their family going through this dark, terrifying nightmare was the knowledge that this inheritance would allow them to properly honor my memory. She spun a beautiful, elaborate lie, claiming they planned to use the trust fund to set up charitable medical foundations in my name to continue the humanitarian work I had loved so much. She begged the judge to grant them the financial closure they needed to finally begin their long, painful healing process. I stood in the hidden side room, listening to every single toxic lie spilling from her mouth. I squeezed my hands into tight, rigid fists until my fingernails dug painfully into my palms. My mother was using my imaginary death to play the ultimate tragic victim. She was deliberately leveraging the genuine tragedy of actual innocent victims who had died in those terrible mountain floods to secure her own unearned wealth. Chad sat behind her nodding solemnly, while mentally spending the millions he needed to pay off his massive fraudulent bridge loan. Emily wiped a completely non-existent tear from her cheek from behind her dark sunglasses. They were all in on it together. They operated as a synchronized, well-oiled machine of pure sociopathic greed. They had zero remorse. They had zero guilt. They only had an insatiable hunger for the money that Beatrice had expressly forbidden them from touching. The judge was clearly moved by my mother's passionate, tearful speech. He expressed his deep, profound sympathies to the family once more. He gathered the legal documents into a neat stack. He picked up his heavy black fountain pen. He positioned the gold tip directly over the final signature line of the permanent disbursement order. This was the exact moment they had been desperately, frantically waiting for. This was the moment the bridge loan would be entirely covered. This was the moment the $1 million mansion would be paid off in cash, and their opulent, elite new lifestyle would become a permanent reality. My mother held her breath. Chad leaned forward in his chair, gripping the armrests. Emily pulled off her sunglasses in anticipation. The entire courtroom was suspended in a heavy, breathless silence, waiting for the stroke of a pen that would finalize the greatest financial theft of their lives. But before the judge could drag the dark ink across the page, David Caldwell stood up from his seat at the respondent's table. He did not rush. He did not shout. He moved with the calm, devastating authority of a man who possessed all the absolute power in the room. He straightened his suit jacket and addressed the bench. His voice was perfectly clear, sharp, and professional, echoing through the quiet, cavernous space.
Your Honor,
David said, his tone slicing right through the heavy emotional atmosphere my mother had created. Before you sign that final release order, I must respectfully intervene. As the named executor of this estate, I am legally bound by a very specific and highly confidential directive. The judge paused, lifting his fountain pen away from the document. He looked at David with a mixture of curiosity and professional annoyance. My mother turned to glare at David, her fragile, grieving mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the furious, desperate predator underneath. Chad's jaw tightened visibly. My deceased client, Beatrice Jenkins, made one final mandatory request regarding the execution of this specific trust. David continued smoothly, his eyes sweeping across my parents' panicked faces. Before any assets can be legally divided or dispersed to any secondary beneficiaries, I am legally obligated to play a final video message for the immediate family in the presence of this court. It is a strictly binding condition of her last will and testament. My mother immediately shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Her face went chalk white, and her mouth hung open in absolute disbelief. The carefully constructed illusion of the grieving, heartbroken mother shattered completely in front of the entire courtroom. She knew Beatrice. She knew her mother-in-law despised her. And in that terrifying, singular moment, she suddenly realized that the dead woman had somehow reached out from the grave to have the absolute final word. I stood in the hidden room, watching my mother's panic explode. The federal agents beside me shifted their weight perfectly, ready for what was about to happen next. The trap had been flawlessly set. The bait had been completely swallowed. Now all that was left was to play the tape and watch their stolen empire burn to ashes. The massive flat-screen television mounted on the wood-paneled wall of the probate courtroom flickered to life. The faint static cleared, revealing a crisp, high-definition image. There she was. My grandmother Beatrice sat proudly in the familiar, high-backed leather executive chair of David Caldwell's law office. The entire courtroom, which had just been filled with the dramatic weeping of my mother, was instantly plunged into a suffocating, absolute silence. You could hear the subtle hum of the overhead air conditioning vents. You could hear the sharp intake of breath from the expensive private litigator my parents had hired. My mother Susan completely froze in her seat. The white tissue she had been using to dab away her fake tears was suspended mid-air halfway to her face. My father, Robert, leaned forward, gripping the edge of the petitioner's table with his jaw hanging slack. My sister Emily pushed her dark, oversized designer sunglasses up into her perfectly styled blonde hair, her mouth parted in utter confusion. Beatrice looked directly into the camera lens. Even through a digital recording, her eyes possessed a sharp, terrifying clarity that demanded absolute, unwavering attention. She adjusted the emerald green silk scarf draped elegantly around her neck and began to speak. Her voice was incredibly strong and deeply resonant, carrying a heavy, undeniable weight that completely shattered the fraudulent, tragic atmosphere my parents had spent the last hour meticulously building. If Robert, Susan, and Emily are currently sitting in a courtroom listening to this tape to demand the release of my trust funds because Sarah is dead, then you have been completely and utterly tricked. Beatrice let those devastating words hang in the heavy air of the courtroom. She leaned slightly closer to the camera. Sarah is not dead. I sent her away. I sent her far into the Appalachian Mountains, specifically to keep her out of your predatory reach. While my heart finally failed. I knew with absolute certainty that the moment I passed away, you would stop at absolutely nothing to get your hands on my estate. You have spent your entire miserable lives consuming resources you never earned, stepping on people who loved you, and destroying anything that stood in your way, including your own youngest daughter. The color completely drained from my mother's face. She looked like all the blood had been instantly siphoned from her veins. She tried to stand up to protest, but her legs seemed to completely fail her, causing her to slump heavily back into the hard wooden chair. Chad, Emily's arrogant real estate broker husband, began shaking his head, frantically muttering under his breath, as the horrifying reality of his $2.5 million fraudulent bridge loan crashed down upon his shoulders. Beatrice continued, her voice echoing flawlessly off the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. I knew that if Sarah was out of communication, you would try something deeply desperate. But I never in my wildest dreams imagined you would be foolish enough to fabricate her actual death. If you have submitted a death certificate to this probate court to expedite my trust, you have committed massive federal fraud. You have perjured yourselves before a sitting judge. You have attempted to steal an inheritance using a lie so vile and so profoundly evil that it permanently strips you of any right to call yourselves family. I laid this trap carefully, and you walked directly into it, with your eyes wide open, completely blinded by your own insatiable greed. The judge, sitting high on his elevated wooden bench, slowly lowered his reading glasses. His face had transformed from a mask of gentle judicial sympathy to a terrifying portrait of absolute unadulterated fury. He glared down at the petitioner's table where my family sat, paralyzed by the digital ghost of the woman they thought they had so easily outsmarted. Beatrice offered one final cold, knowing smile to the camera. You thought you could bury Sarah in an empty box and dance on her grave to collect a $6 million check. But Sarah is stronger than you will ever be. She is my sole rightful heir, and I believe it is finally time for my true heir to enter the room. The television screen faded silently to black. For exactly 5 seconds, the courtroom was trapped in a heavy, terrifying vacuum of total silence. No one breathed. No one moved. The private litigator looked physically ill. Then the heavy double oak doors at the very back of the public gallery swung open with a loud, echoing crack. I walked into the center aisle. I was wearing the immaculate, tailored white suit I had carefully chosen the night before. My posture was perfectly straight. My head was held high. I was not the scared, discarded teenager they had thrown onto a dark porch with 2 garbage bags 15 years ago. I was not the exhausted medical volunteer they had happily left to rot in an Appalachian mudslide. I was a grown woman, an experienced medical accountant, a survivor, and the absolute architect of their total destruction. Flanking me on either side, walking with precise military coordination, were two imposing federal agents from the white-collar crime division. Their dark suits contrasted sharply with my white jacket, creating a stunning visual of impending justice. The reaction from the front of the room was instantaneous and violently chaotic. Emily let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream, as if she had literally seen a rotting corpse rise from the earth and walk toward her. She scrambled backward in sheer terror, knocking her heavy wooden chair over with a loud, deafening crash. She collided with Chad, who was staring at me with his eyes bulging, completely paralyzed by the realization that his luxurious new life was instantly over. My father, Robert, staggered backward from the table. He had been holding his expensive leather briefcase tightly against his chest like a shield. As he saw me walking purposefully down the aisle, his hands simply gave out. The briefcase hit the polished hardwood floor, bursting open, and scattering hundreds of fraudulent financial documents, real estate brochures, and banking forms across the walkway. He fell to his knees, scrambling uselessly to gather the papers, with trembling hands, his face a portrait of complete and utter ruin. But it was my mother, Susan, who provided the most satisfying reaction of all. She did not scream. She did not fall to the floor. She stood perfectly still, gripping the edge of the petitioner's table, so hard her knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. She looked at me approaching the bench, and her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant, wealthy facade was entirely gone. The fake, grieving mother act was completely shattered. All that remained was a terrified, cornered predator, realizing the heavy steel cage door had just slammed, permanently shut. I did not look at them as I walked past their table. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on the judge. I approached the wooden podium standing right next to my attorney, David Caldwell. The two federal agents bypassed the podium and took their tactical positions directly behind my parents' table, blocking any possible exit.
Your Honor,
I said, my voice steady and clear, ringing out in the massive quiet room. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am the youngest daughter of Robert and Susan Jenkins. As you can clearly see, I am very much alive. I have brought a certified forensic file containing my verified government fingerprints, my original birth records, and a sworn, notarized affidavit from my dental provider, officially confirming my identity. I handed the thick leather binder to the court clerk, who immediately passed it up to the bench. The judge opened the binder. His eyes scanned the certified documents with rapid precision. The silence in the room was so thick, it felt physically heavy on my shoulders. The judge looked up from the binder and fixed a glare of pure, unadulterated wrath on my parents. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and struck it against the sounding block with a violent force that made the entire room jump. The loud crack echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, sealing their fate. This court officially cancels and voids all previous disbursement orders regarding the estate of Beatrice Jenkins, the judge announced, his voice booming with absolute authority. The preliminary death certificate submitted by the petitioners is hereby stricken from the official record. Furthermore, I am immediately referring this entire matter to the federal authorities for criminal prosecution. You have abused this court. You have made a mockery of the legal system, and you have attempted to steal millions of dollars through egregious, premeditated, malicious fraud. The judge looked directly at the federal agents standing behind my family. Officers, he said with a stern nod, you may proceed. The senior agent stepped forward. He placed a heavy, uncompromising hand on my father's trembling shoulder. Robert Jenkins, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive bank fraud, and perjury. He read the Miranda rights in a calm, practiced monotone that sounded like the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. The courtroom immediately devolved into absolute pandemonium. Chad began shouting desperately at his private litigator, begging him to file an injunction or do something to stop the arrests. But their expensive attorney was already furiously packing his briefcase, distancing himself as quickly as humanly possible from clients who had just flagrantly lied to a federal judge. He practically sprinted down the center aisle, leaving them completely abandoned to their fate. Emily dissolved into a puddle of hysterical, hyperventilating sobs as a female federal agent pulled her arms firmly behind her back and secured the cold steel handcuffs around her wrists. She was wailing loudly about her new mansion, about her ruined social reputation, about how this was all a terrible, innocent misunderstanding. Chad tried to aggressively argue with the agents, claiming he knew absolutely nothing about the fake death certificate, but his legal signature was all over the fraudulent bank loan documents. He was forcefully cuffed and pushed toward the side exit. My mother was the last to be restrained. As the federal agent clamped the metal cuffs onto her wrists, she finally turned her head and looked directly at me. The sheer toxic venom in her eyes was staggering, but there was no actual power left behind it. She was entirely broken, stripped of her wealth and her dignity. "Sarah," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure desperation. "You planned this. You set us up. We are your family. How could you do this to your own flesh and blood?" I looked at the woman who had thrown me onto a dark porch with 2 garbage bags when I was just 13 years old. I looked at the woman who had happily staged a fake televised funeral to steal my inheritance while I was starving in a mountain disaster zone. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I only felt a profound, deeply cleansing peace. "You stopped being my family a long time ago, Susan," I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You deliberately dug a grave for me so you could steal my life. I just decided to step aside and let you fall into it." I stood beside David Caldwell and watched the federal agents march my mother, my father, my sister, and my brother-in-law down the long center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind them with a loud thud, leaving the courtroom perfectly quiet once again. The massive, suffocating storm of my childhood had finally broken, and the sky above me was entirely clear. David placed a gentle, supportive hand on my shoulder. He smiled a warm, genuine smile. "Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of you, Sarah. You handled that with absolute perfection." Over the next few weeks, the terrifying reality of their situation crashed down on them with brutal, unforgiving force. Because Chad had illegally used my fraudulent death certificate to secure the $2.5 million bridge loan, the private lending firm immediately defaulted the account. The bank relentlessly seized the $1 million mansion my parents had just purchased in the gated community. They rapidly repossessed the luxury cars, the custom designer furniture, and every single asset tied to the fraudulent funds. My parents were left completely bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and facing decades in federal prison. The legal system moved swiftly and without mercy. The overwhelming evidence we had meticulously gathered, the surveillance tapes capturing their cruel laughter, the signed bank documents, and Beatrice's undeniable video confession, left them with absolutely no viable defense. They were denied bail due to the extreme severity of the federal bank fraud charges and their clear flight risk. They permanently traded their tailored suits and designer morning dresses for standard-issue orange prison jumpsuits. As for me, I finally accessed my grandmother's beautiful, generous legacy. I moved out of that cheap, dreary motel and purchased a modest, comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by massive, ancient oak trees. I did exactly what my mother had falsely promised the judge I would do. I used a significant portion of the trust fund to establish a permanent charitable foundation providing medical supplies and emergency funding to the isolated mountain communities that had suffered so deeply during the mudslides. I went back to work as a medical billing specialist, not because I needed the money, but because I loved the quiet, logical puzzle of the numbers. I lived my life entirely on my own terms, completely free from the toxic gravity of the people who had tried so desperately to erase me. I learned the hardest, most valuable lesson a person can ever learn. Blood does not automatically make someone family. DNA does not grant a person a permanent free pass to abuse, manipulate, and exploit you. Real family is built on mutual respect, honesty, and showing up for the people you care about, even when it is incredibly difficult. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the exact ones you need to be protected from. Setting firm, absolute boundaries is not an act of revenge. It is an act of fundamental survival. You do not owe toxic people a seat at your table just because you happen to share a last name. You have every single right to protect your peace, to claim your self-worth, and to build a beautiful, thriving life entirely without them. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If my story resonated with you, If you have ever had to stand up against a toxic family member or fight for your own right to exist, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most. I would love to know where you are joining from today. Drop a comment below with your city and the time you are watching this video. Let me know what you would have done if you were standing in my shoes. Remember, you completely define your own value. You are entirely enough just as you are. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story. The wheels of federal justice turn with a slow, grinding certainty, but the banks move with the speed of a falling guillotine. Within 48 hours of that explosive courtroom hearing, the luxurious, carefully constructed fantasy world my parents and sister had built was entirely pulverized. The private lending firm, realizing that the $2.5 million bridge loan was secured by a fabricated death certificate and pure perjury, immediately declared the account in catastrophic default. They did not send polite reminder letters. They sent armed asset recovery agents. I did not go to watch the foreclosure in person, but Thomas Mitchell, my ever-reliable private investigator, could not resist taking a final drive through that exclusive gated community. He later described the scene to me over coffee. It was a spectacular public humiliation. A fleet of flatbed tow trucks idled on the manicured cobblestone driveway of their new mansion. The neighbors, the same wealthy elites my mother had tried so desperately to impress, at her catered lawn party stood on their sprawling porches, whispering and pointing. They watched as the pristine white Mercedes SUV and my father's brand-new loaded Porsche were unceremoniously chained up and dragged away. The bank seized the $1.8 million property before my family had even unpacked all their imported Italian furniture. They lost absolutely everything in a matter of days, but the financial ruin was only the beginning of their nightmare. The federal government does not take kindly to citizens who use a declared national disaster to commit massive bank fraud. Robert, Susan, Emily, and Chad were denied bail. The judge deemed them a severe flight risk given the magnitude of their financial deception. They spent the months leading up to their trial sitting in standard-issue jail cells, completely stripped of their designer clothes, their country club memberships, and their arrogant superiority. When the criminal trial finally concluded, there was no dramatic courtroom battle. The evidence we had meticulously gathered was simply too overwhelming. The high-definition dashcam video of Emily and Chad laughing about my death, the fraudulent banking documents, and my grandmother Beatrice's undeniable video testimony left them with no possible defense. They were forced to accept plea deals. My father and Chad received 10 years in federal prison for conspiracy and bank fraud. My mother and Emily, as the primary beneficiaries of the fake death claim, received 8 years for identity theft and perjury. As the judge handed down their sentences, I sat in the back row of the gallery. My mother turned to look at me one last time, her face pale, hollow, and utterly defeated. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked back at her with absolute indifference. She was no longer a monster in my mind. She was just a stranger facing the consequences of her own terrible choices. With the criminal proceedings concluded, the probate court moved swiftly to honor Beatrice's true wishes. I sat in David Caldwell's quiet mahogany office on a sunny Tuesday morning as he slid a final stack of transfer documents across the desk. I signed my name, my living, breathing, legally verified name, on the dotted lines. Within 24 hours, the entire $6 million estate was formally transferred into my secure accounts. Suddenly, possessing that kind of staggering wealth is a deeply surreal experience. For my entire life, I had survived by counting every single penny. I had worked grueling shifts at diners just to pay for basic community college courses. Now I could afford to buy a mansion in Buckhead. I could afford a fleet of luxury cars. I could afford to live exactly the way my sister Emily had always wanted to live, but I had absolutely no desire to become the kind of person who defined their worth by the brand of their handbag or the size of their driveway. Beatrice had not left me this money so I could hoard it. She had left it to me because she knew I understood the profound difference between a price tag and actual value. I used a modest portion of the inheritance to purchase a comfortable, quiet home on the outskirts of Atlanta. It has a beautiful wraparound porch, a large kitchen bathed in natural light, and a sprawling backyard shaded by ancient oak trees. It is peaceful, safe, and entirely mine. I did not quit my job as a medical billing specialist. I genuinely enjoy the logical puzzle of the work, and maintaining a routine keeps me grounded in reality. The vast majority of the $6 million, however, was redirected toward a much higher purpose. Working closely with David Caldwell and a team of philanthropic advisors, I established a permanent charitable trust. I named it the Beatrice Jenkins Medical Education Fund. The foundation has a very specific and unwavering mission. We provide full tuition scholarships, living stipends, and mental health support to young adults who have been estranged, abandoned, or financially cut off by their toxic families. We find the kids who are sleeping in their cars while trying to finish their nursing degrees. We find the brilliant young minds who want to become doctors, paramedics, and researchers, but have no safety net to catch them if they fall. We give them the exact thing my grandmother gave to me. We give them a second chance, and we give them the absolute certainty that their past does not dictate their future. In its very first year of operation, the foundation fully funded the medical education of 12 incredible young men and women. Every time I sign a scholarship approval letter, I feel a profound healing warmth spread through my chest. I am actively using the money my family tried to steal to empower the exact kind of people my family always despised. Last Sunday, I drove out to Oakwood Cemetery. It was a beautiful, crisp morning. The air tasted clean, hinting at the changing season. I walked slowly down the paved pathways, navigating the rows of polished granite and marble headstones. I deliberately chose a route that took me past the family plot, where my parents had staged my fake burial. The empty plot was still there, a bizarre monument to their unparalleled greed, but the temporary marker bearing my name had been legally removed. I looked at the patch of undisturbed grass and felt absolutely nothing. The ghost of Sarah Jenkins no longer haunted that space. I continued walking until I reached a quiet, elevated section of the cemetery, overlooking a gentle slope of dogwood trees. This was where my grandmother Beatrice was truly laid to rest. Her headstone was simple, elegant, and strong, exactly like the woman it honored. I knelt down on the soft grass and gently placed a single white rose at the base of the granite stone. I did not cry. My tears had all been shed a long time ago. Instead, I traced the engraved letters of her name with my fingertips and spoke to her in the quiet morning air. I told her about the foundation. I told her about the students whose lives she was changing from beyond the grave. I thanked her for her brilliant, ruthless foresight and for loving me enough to orchestrate a trap that set me permanently free. I told her that I finally understood her final lesson. You cannot fix people who are fundamentally broken by their own selfishness, but you can build a beautiful, meaningful life far away from their toxic reach. I stood up, brushed the grass from my knees, and took a deep breath. Looking down at the white rose resting against the stone, my soul felt completely, wonderfully at peace. The long war was finally over, and I had won the only prize that truly mattered. I had won my freedom. If you are listening to my story right now, I want you to carry this truth with you. Conditional love is not actually love at all. It is a transaction. When people only value you for what you can provide, how much you can sacrifice, or how quiet you can make yourself to keep their peace, they are not treating you like family. They are treating you like an asset. And you have every single right in the world to walk away from a table where respect is no longer being served. You do not need to share DNA to find your true family. You do not need the approval of people who continually disrespect your boundaries. True family is found in the people who stand by you in the storm, who defend your name when you are not in the room, and who celebrate your victories without a shred of jealousy. Setting a boundary with a toxic parent or a cruel sibling does not make you a bad person. It makes you a survivor. Do not ever let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting your own peace. You owe yourself the beautiful, thriving life you are capable of building. Thank you so much for staying with me through this incredible journey. If my story resonated with you, if you have ever had to cut ties to save yourself, or if you simply believe in ultimate justice, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps these stories reach the people who need a reminder of their own strength. I would absolutely love to hear from you today. Drop a comment below letting me know what city or country you are watching from and what time it is right now. Tell me your thoughts on how everything turned out. Take care of yourself fiercely, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story. Looking back on everything that has transpired, I realize now that the hardest truth to accept in this life is that sometimes the very people who are supposed to protect you are the ones holding the sharpest knife. For so many agonizing years, I genuinely believed that if I just gave a little more, sacrificed a little harder, and stayed incredibly quiet, my family would eventually see my true value. I thought my absolute unwavering loyalty could somehow cure their toxic, relentless greed. But the brutal reality is that your endless sacrifice will never, ever reform people who value cold, hard cash more than they value human life. You simply cannot love the deep selfishness out of someone who views you purely as an asset to be liquidated for their own luxury. We are constantly conditioned by society to believe that blood ties are an unbreakable sacred bond that absolutely requires our permanent blind devotion. We are taught to forgive the unforgivable simply because the people hurting us happen to share our last name and our history. But I am here to tell you that is an incredibly dangerous lie. Drawing a firm line in the sand and walking away from toxic family members is never an act of betrayal. Setting those limits is a vital, necessary shield, protecting your own life, your own peace, and your own sanity. You do not owe your abusers a seat at your dinner table just because they raised you or grew up in the exact same house. Real family is not defined by a simple accident of biology. Real, authentic family is built entirely on mutual respect, honest support, and showing up for one another in the darkest, most terrifying moments, without expecting a financial return. It took a massive, catastrophic mountain storm and a horrifying betrayal to make me finally see my own inherent worth. I had to permanently let go of the loving family I desperately wished I had in order to survive the cruel family I actually got. But standing on the other side of that absolute nightmare, I can honestly tell you that the profound, deeply cleansing peace of living in your own truth is worth every single tear shed along the way. If you are listening to my voice right now and you have ever been exploited, dismissed, or deeply abused by your own flesh and blood, I want you to know that you are not alone. The heavy guilt you carry actually belongs to them. Please take a moment to drop a comment below and share a piece of your own story. Let us build a strong, supportive community of survivors who absolutely refuse to be silenced anymore. If my personal journey resonated with your heart today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss out on our upcoming stories of seeking absolute justice and finding true personal freedom. Before you close this video, do not forget to leave a quick comment telling me exactly which state you are watching from and what time it is right now on your clock. I read every single one of your messages, and I absolutely love knowing how far these stories travel across the country. Thank you for giving me your valuable time and your open heart today. Goodbye for now, and please always remember to fiercely cherish your own incredible worth.